My name is John Carlton, and I'm the organizer of Frankfort Heritage Week's coalition that has put on Frankfort Heritage Week annually since 2021. And Paul Sawyier Library has been instrumental in Frankfort Heritage Week since the very beginning, and I thank you all for coming out today. 250 years ago, on July 16, 1773, a group of surveyors from Virginia crossed the Kentucky River at Leestown and entered what one of them referred to as the Great Meadow on the river. From there, via Cove Spring, they came to what is now North Frankfort. One of those surveyors, Hancock Taylor, proceeded to lay out a survey of the area at the request of fellow explorer Robert McAfee. This land eventually became the land we now call home, Frankfort, the capital of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and county seat of Franklin County. Though explorers such as Christopher Gist, Daniel Boone, and John Finley had ventured through the area of Frankfort between 1750 and the 1770s, Hancock Taylor's survey of Frankfort set the stage and was the catalyst for many important events that followed, including the founding of Leestown in 1776, the founding of Frankfort in 1886, the establishment of Kentucky as a state and Frankfort its capital, and the formation of Franklin County, all of which have upcoming 250th anniversaries. At Frankfort's centennial celebration on October 6, 1886, a marker was set at the original location of Taylor's first survey mark, at the southernmost block of Ann Street, and rededications of this marker have been a part of every Frankfort Founders Day and major anniversaries of Frankfort's founding since. Tomorrow we will continue that tradition at 1:30 at First Christian Church, and I hope you will join us. For many reasons, early history was often embellished and is replete with inaccuracies and stereotypes, particularly of family histories, Native Americans, the enslaved, and more. Our job as historians, researchers, and writers is to constantly update and correct this information as best as we can so that history is accurately recorded and characterized to the public. I have an admission to make. Today's front page article in the State Journal contains some inaccuracies. As many of us were preparing for this event, we encountered many of these inaccuracies, and we tried our best to weed them out before today and tomorrow. Historians often live by a rule: when in doubt, leave it out. Unfortunately, we sometimes don't know to doubt facts until after publication, and that is what occurred today. The Samuel Adams of the expedition is not the same Bostonian as the Boston Tea Party, though some said he was. The Samuel Adams of the McAfee Company was one Samuel Clark Adams. Additionally, Jenny Chin Morton of the Kentucky Historical Society was not a member of the National Society of Colonial Dames, the Daughters of the American Revolution, nor was she a descendant of Daniel Boone's sister, even though there is a monument at Bryan Station that alludes to that fact by listing Sarah Bryan Chin as a member of the attack on Bryan Station. These are some of the embellishments that have persisted over time. Being a historian and writer requires being a skeptic and is often considered as inglorious as being a trash collector. They obviously serve an important and fundamental purpose for which we are extremely grateful, but we are also tasked with carrying treasured belongings to the landfill, where they sometimes, or in the case of inaccuracies, deserve, and stereotypes deserve to be. So our goal today is not only to celebrate and educate you about this seminal event in Frankfort's and the Commonwealth's history, but to also set the record straight and to dispel many myths and inaccuracies that have persisted over time. I'd like to thank our presenters and moderators today. We have a very special group of experts and historians that will help with our understanding of these events. The following agencies, organizations, their staff, and individuals are to thank for this weekend's events for either their participation or help with organizing. Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition, City of Frankfort, former City Manager Laura Hagg and Interim City Manager Penny Peevler, Franklin County Fiscal Court, especially Judge Executive Mueller and Deputy Judge Kennedy, Paul Sawyer Public Library, especially Diane Dehoney, Liberty Hall Historic Site, especially Jessica Stavros, Capital City Museum, especially Dr. Ellie Haskin-Wagner, Dr. Bill Kincaid, and the folks of the First Christian Church Ann Street. And the participants, Representative Derek Graham of the Kentucky General Assembly, Judge Thomas Wingate of the Kentucky Court of Justice, Candy Atkinson of the Kentucky Office of the Secretary of State, the Honorable Crit Llewellyn, Leslie Miller of the National Society, daughter of the American Revolutions, National Society of Colonial Dames of America and the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and the Kentucky Daughters of the American Revolution. Scott Alves, Julie Sanders, and Tyler McDaniel of the Kentucky Historical Society, Craig Potts of the Kentucky Heritage Council, Tressa Brown of the Kentucky Native American Heritage Commission, Dr. Drew Andrews of the Kentucky Geological Survey, Patrick Lewis of the Filson Historical Society, Emily Preston of the James Herod Trust for Historic Preservation, Reverend Leslie Whitlock of First Corinthian Missionary Baptist Church, Robin Antonucci of the Frankfort Franklin County Tourist and Convention Commission, David Goins and the Saxton's Cornet Band, Dr. Richard Lawrence Taylor, and Sheila Mason Burton. And I'm honored to share with you a special video made especially for you by the 63rd Governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Governor Andy Beshear. There we go.
Hi everyone, it's Andy, and I'm so excited to help you celebrate Frankfort, the special community my family and I are proud to call home. 250 years ago, a team of surveyors crossed the Kentucky River at Leestown Point, arriving at the area that would eventually become the city of Frankfort. At that time, one of the travelers called it the Great Meadow on the river, and I think this still holds up. Frankfort is a place where I am proud to live and raise my children. Folks in Frankfort work so hard every day to make sure the capital and the entire city are the best they can be. And let me tell you, I've never seen anyone leave Andy's Bakery or Hoggy's Ice Cream or Bees or Poppies without a smile, including myself. That's because in this city, we welcome visitors from across the Commonwealth and around the world who want to know what Team Kentucky is all about. So often this city represents our entire state, and Frankfort always rises to the challenge. So today, we're celebrating Frankfort, but we're also celebrating Kentucky as a whole. Hancock Taylor's survey of the town of Frankfort was a catalyst for many important events that followed over the next 2 decades, including the founding of Leestown, the founding of Frankfort, the establishment of Kentucky as a state, and Frankfort as its capital. And let me tell you folks, I couldn't be more proud to be a Kentuckian. And today is the day we get to show that pride. Today we are rededicating the marker where Hancock Taylor and his team first arrived in Frankfort 250 years ago. I want to thank John Carlton and everyone at the Paul Sawyier Public Library, the Liberty Hall Historic Site, and the Kentucky Heritage Council for putting this weekend of events together. The Commonwealth is fortunate to have over 370 history-related organizations, and y'all play a fundamental role in our understanding of what it means to be a Kentuckian. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who showed up today for showing your Kentucky and Frankfort pride. Enjoy the event, and God bless our great Commonwealth.
Thank you all so much for being here today. As John said, my name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian here at Paul Sawyier, and we're thrilled to have such a lovely crowd turn out to celebrate this wonderful anniversary. So thank you. Thank you to John for all your hard work on this weekend of events, and thank you for including the library in this celebration. So I have the privilege to introduce our first speaker for this afternoon. Dr. William Drew Andrews is going to be presenting A River Runs Through It, Geology and Geoheritage Around Frankfort, Kentucky. The rocks under our landscape play a critical role in defining the shape and the characteristics of the land that we live on. Landforms, streams, resources, and natural hazards are all related to the geology of the area. This presentation is going to explore how the rocks around Frankfort have played a critical role in our scenery, transportation, economy, history, and our science. Now, Dr. Andrews is a geologist and a section head for geologic mapping at the Kentucky Geological Survey for the University of Kentucky. He has deep family and professional interest in the geology and history of Kentucky. Please help me to welcome Dr. William Drew Andrews.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with you all. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. When I was young, I wanted to be a historian. I was about history, especially Civil War history. And somewhere around 19 or so, somebody convinced me that you couldn't make a great living at that. And I took a class in historical geology, and here is a field that admittedly pays a little better, and you're still talking about history. And so I've always had this interest in human history, this interest in cultural history, and I've brought that with me as I go through my geological career. A little bit of background. The Kentucky Geological Survey used to be here in Frankfort. The office used to actually be over in the building next to the old state capitol. But after World War II, it got moved to the University of Kentucky, where we are now a full research center at the university. And our mission is to study all aspects of the geology of the state, and to then communicate that, make that information available for industry, for academia, for citizens, for government agencies. And so if you go to our website, kgs.uky.edu, you can explore a whole range of different information that we have available on the geology of the state. And I also want to pay a little bit of recognition to a certain gentleman named Willard Rouse Gilson. When the survey was here in Frankfort, Dr. Gilson was the 6th state geologist. And this, to say that he was a bold personality is an understatement. He's one of the most prolific authors, period. Not just in Kentucky, not just in Frankfort, period. He had his own printing press in the basement, that helped. But he was a remarkable geologist and a remarkable navigator of Kentucky politics and Kentucky personalities himself. Did some very, very remarkable work. And as of 2 weeks ago, I'm sort of following in his footsteps. I was named acting state geologist for Kentucky. But I can tell you, you do not get the cool boots until later. But my dissertation was actually on some of the work that, followed on some of the work that Dr. Gilson did. And I had access to LIDAR and the most modern mapping techniques and geographic information systems. And I went and rechecked a lot of the information that he produced before topographic maps were available for the state, before any of the aerial photographs. And I found one single thing I could argue interpretive different from what he had worked on. He did some remarkable geology. But, you know, we're here to talk about not the people per se, but about the rocks. Other people that are going to follow me are going to be talking about the people. And when you're talking about Frankfort, you're talking about limestone. The story is limestone. Boring, gray, it's everywhere. There's nothing extraordinary in the rock collecting world about limestone. People like shiny crystals. You're disagreeing with me, and I appreciate that very much. But people get excited about the shiny, sparkly minerals, right? And limestone usually isn't that. But it's fundamental. Limestone is underneath, literally, everything we do in central Kentucky, and it's a big deal. The limestone we have here is just chock full of different fossils. And it came from a different place. The limestone in Kentucky, and specifically here around Frankfort, it's about 450 million years old, and it's from a warm, shallow sea, and this is pre-Pangea. This is early in a different phase of plate tectonics. And Kentucky at the time looked a whole lot like the Bahamas, these kind of isolated islands out in the middle of the ocean, but not as many cruise ships, obviously, right? And when you look under the surface of the water, you end up with this just teeming with life. One thing that would be very strange is you wouldn't see any fish. This was before fish had developed, but there were all sorts of other creatures that were living in this water and growing and dying and eating each other, and then we find their remains in these fossils. And so these limestones are very important to a lot of different aspects of understanding Frankfort. The caves, the sinkholes, the springs, that karst landscape that we're familiar with here in central Kentucky that is only, attributable to limestone. From a more practical standpoint, that limestone provides the aggregate for our roads, for concrete, sidewalks. People took cut stone to make some of the steps and things around town. And the stone walls that we find all over central Kentucky are built out of these limestones, these 450 million year old limestones. And these particular limestones we have here generate very good soils. And so Kentucky, because of its climate, but also because of its rocks and the soils that have developed on those rocks, is a very, very fertile place, and it grows plants really well. And any animal that feeds on those plants also does very well. So we end up here, the earliest farmers were able to generate a lot of corn. And because of the springs in this limestone-rich karst landscape, they had a very reliable water supply. And if you have too much corn and you're trying to figure out how to sell it, you want to put it on a boat, take it down to New Orleans. Well, your corn gets wet and you end up in New Orleans with a boatload of mush, right? And you can't sell it. So how do you get your corn, your extra corn, to market? Well, you figure out how to make something that's a little more popular and travels better. And so bourbon was a very practical outlet for all this surplus corn that we could grow. And so, Buffalo Trace, just this week I saw that Buffalo Trace swept the top 3 in the international bourbon competition. That's right here. There's another aspect to the story besides the limestone. It's the rivers, okay? The first part of the story, though, doesn't happen here. It happens up in Ohio and Indiana. The original Kentucky River flowed through here, got to about Carrollton, and turned north, not south. And it flowed up past what is now Cincinnati, toward Dayton, and it met what's called the Taze River. When the first major ice age swept into the northern United States, before it was the United States, it blocked that river and completely reorganized where the Kentucky River flowed. And when that happened, the Kentucky River had a shorter distance to get to the Gulf of Mexico. Instead of looping all the way up through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and then back down, it turned south near Carrollton and went toward the Gulf. The new Ohio River was born at that time. When it had that shorter distance, all of a sudden, it cuts down its valley. It's called base level in geology terminology. And so you end up then with this valley cut deeper into the plateau that we're around. And so the river itself had enough volume. It cut deeply, 300 feet down into the valley. And the smaller creeks tried to keep up. And so they cut off the edges of the plateau trying to get down there. This would have been a big barrier, except for those creeks, right? And so animals would go down those creek valleys to get to the river, to cross the river, and come back up the other side. And that became a pathway. So getting down those little valleys to the big valley and back up was a big deal. Details in the rock. The fact that our rocks here around Frankfort are very thin-bedded, and there's a little bit of shale in between some of those beds, lets the river cut sideways and not just down. And so we get these meanders of the river that form in this rock. And after a while, the meander cuts big enough, it cuts itself off. And here around Frankfort, we have several what are called abandoned meanders. And these have an important role in where we're able to build. Okay, so it's less likely to flood in these abandoned meanders. It's low ground, it's flat, still wonderful farmland. And so a lot of Frankfort was actually built around some of these abandoned meanders. Fort Hill is sitting in the middle of one of those, and the flat ground that goes all the way around it is one of these abandoned meanders. Now, that river is the highway for thousands of years. For animals, for indigenous peoples, this was how you moved yourself, your materials, your goods. It's how you communicated. If you went overland, it was slow and it was hard work. If you got on the river, you could get there quickly. And so no matter the people, no matter the time, finding a way to get there quickly is the preference. And so when some of the earliest hunters and explorers from the European colonies started moving west, they also used the rivers. And so They were the highway for a long, long, long time. And so goods that were moved around Kentucky to begin with, or moved from Kentucky, didn't go overland. People didn't put it on a wagon and carry it back to Philadelphia. They put it on a boat and sent it down the Mississippi and then around a ship to Philadelphia or whatever, and it was cheaper that way. It's actually easier than trying to go over land. So the rivers were the highway. Now, we can talk a little bit about how here at Frankfort, how you can come down the creek, cross the river, and go up the other side, and so you have access to the valley here. There's a big stretch of Kentucky where that access to the valley is very limited, very restricted, and that's the Kentucky River Palisades. The limestones that we get in the Palisades are a little bit different. They're thicker beds, there's no shale in between, and the river can't cut sideways. It's just kind of caught in this valley that got cut 300 feet deep. And so in that area, the Palisades are a corridor. They're a channel, but there's no off-ramp, and there's no on-ramp on that highway, and so, or very few. And so it's goods that are in eastern Kentucky. When you put them on a boat and you start down the river, you have a few access points that don't have large communities, and then you get into the Palisades. And you can't get out, right? Once you get to Frankfort, all of a sudden you're coming out of the Palisades and the valley opens up. And so this was the first place where you could catch your raft. There were some people around you could sell to. You were between Lexington and Louisville who would buy your stuff. And so Frankfort became a really important point of navigation. Okay, Frankfort became a really important point of navigation and an end point for trade. So people from eastern Kentucky would come to Frankfort, offload their stuff, and walk home. And then the merchants in Frankfort would sell things on to Louisville, to Lexington, or send it on down the river toward New Orleans or wherever they were selling from there. So some of the earliest engineered river navigation in this part of the country was brought to Frankfort in the 1830s and 1840s. And so this is the view from Jim's Seafood, okay? This is Lock and Dam number 4. And they got the lock and dam system built that far, and they kind of stalled. They didn't finish it all the way up to Lock and Dam 14 until around 1910, right? So it took a long, long, long time to keep building these, but they made sure they got to Frankfort, because Frankfort was an important point. And Frankfort grew. Right down here in the river valley, it was a very important point of commerce. So it was a hub. Louisville, with the Falls of the Ohio, same sort of thing. The river drove the location and drove the opportunity for the commerce at Louisville. And there was a good link between Frankfort and Louisville, both along the river, and then as soon as they could build a railroad, they went Frankfort to Louisville to keep that commerce and to solidify that commerce and to have secure routes for that. So yeah, there's the money. Yes, there's the transportation, but it's also just really pretty, right? And so the Palisades are beautiful. And that brought Paul Sawyier. The whole library is named after him. He's one of the most famous Kentucky authors or Kentucky artists, and certainly my favorite. And so he did an amazing amount of work along the Kentucky River and along the Elkhorn, based out of Frankfort. And then there's other little things you don't think about. The Capitol City Museum has the exhibit on the fishing reels. People like to fish here, and the fishing was different than it was over east. The water's a little different, the creek's a little different species of fish, so you needed a little different technology to do it right. The custom-built fishing reels that came out of Frankfort were nationally and internationally known because of the rivers, because of the creeks. And so, in the interest of kind of keeping things on time, because I'm going to kind of close it up, the combination of the rocks, those limestones, bring a whole bunch of things together here. And the rivers and the erosion patterns of the rivers bring a whole lot of things together here. It shaped our transportation, our economy, our scenery, and the natural resources here at Frankfort. Makes it a really special place. there's this term in geology called geoheritage, and when they try to evaluate, this is a world Heritage Organization kind of thing, when they try to evaluate a place and the value of the geoheritage there, they look at scientific. Well, the rocks here, the road cuts that we have here in Frankfort give us wonderful access to learn about the geology of the area, so there's significant scientific value. We have scientists that evolved out of Frankfurt, being able to work here at Frankfurt, learn a lot, and say something about the broader world. Our economy, very closely tied to the geology. Our history is tied to that geology. Our aesthetics are tied to that geology. In every one of the measures that the world geoheritage community would evaluate a place, Frankfurt's going to score. And so you have something here that is definitely worth appreciating, worth being proud of, and hopefully kind of sets the stage for the folks to come after. One of our first virtual field trips that we did in our office was of Coast Spring Park, because of the ties between the geology, the landscape, and the history there at the park. And it's accessible on our website. If you have your phone with you right now, you can actually do that QR code and save it on your phone, look at it later. It's just a nice little virtual field trip that talks about the geology, talks about the features you can see, and helps make some of these connections. And so if you have any questions, you're absolutely welcome to email me. I would love to follow up with you. Again, there's the website for the Kentucky Geological Survey. And I just want to give, again, kudos to Dr. Ellie and the Capital City Museum. And the exhibits that they have there are first rate in terms of acknowledging the landscape and the role that it's had in the history and making those connections in such a clear, engaging, and professional way. I've been pursuing sort of geoheritage exhibits at different places for a long time, and it's, again, a gem. So if you haven't had stopped by lately, go have a look. So that's what I have.
I am pleased to welcome for our next presentation, Tressa Brown. She will be presenting the American Indian communities in Kentucky. American Indian communities have been in Kentucky for more than 11,000 years. When Euro-Americans settled here, Shawnee, Cherokee, and Chickasaw, among others, already lived here. Myths and misconceptions about American Indian people permeate many sources of information. We all dispel some of those myths about Native people that persist. We will dispel some of those myths about Native people that persist. And she'll also be discussing Kentucky's Native heritage and reviewing its long history, at least briefly. Tressa Brown received her BA in Biology and Anthropology at Transylvania University and her MA in Anthropology and Museum Studies from Arizona State University. She is currently the coordinator for the Kentucky Native American Heritage Commission, the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Commission. She has worked for the past 25 years providing Native American educational programming for schools and the public. Her primary focus has been to identify the stereotypes and myths about Native Americans in general and Kentucky's Native people in particular. Her position at KHC is to provide accurate information to educators and the public about Kentucky's American Indian history, the diversity of Native cultures, as well as the issues affecting Native people in contemporary society. Please help me to welcome Tressa Brown. Click right here.
Okay, just
And, yeah,
the forward.
And just kind of stay a little bit close to that. So.
I really dislike this kind of technology, so I'll do my best to stay in one place. Good afternoon. I do work for the Kentucky Heritage Council, and those three commissions are under my purview. Working with those communities across the state has brought me into contact with lots of Native people that are still here in Kentucky. So let's bust up the myth right now that, how many people have heard no native people lived in Kentucky? Okay. Yeah, no, no. It is untrue, and it is certainly untrue that there are no native people in Kentucky today. There are like 90,000. Frankfort is not one of the top 3, but you still have a few hundred American Indian people living in Franklin County. So just so you know. We're going to get going. I know that Dr. Andrew had a lot of time to get through. I also have a lot of time to get through. So 12,000 years in 30 minutes is kind of a hard thing for me. Okay. So on the table in the back, we have this poster, and this is an illustration of Kentucky's native history. If you notice, it starts around 12,000 years ago, and then pretty quickly it splits and goes up two different tracks, one to the right and one to the left. If you think of Kentucky split at the Falls of the Ohio, straight down, then you have the western and eastern paths, which line up to what's on the poster. The right side is the eastern part of the state, and the left side is the western part of the state. And the time frames are skewed just a little, but the same stuff happened all the way across the Commonwealth. All of the items that you see illustrated here are actual artifacts found in the state. So nothing is kind of supposed. All of those are actual artifacts. So we're going to start way back at the Paleo period, 12,000 to 8,000 years BC. And at this time, these folks were hunters and gatherers. They were hunting large megafauna, and this is pretty much across the state. So woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, cave bears, that's what these folks were hunting. And they were hunting with this type of tool, which is this is a spear point, and it's not like the spear point that was in Chicago or something. It's only about 6 or 8 inches long, but if you're talking about hunting something that's 12 feet tall with a rock tied to the stick, you're doing a pretty good job, okay? And these people, they came down, they came into Kentucky from the north. And at that time, the environment looked quite a bit different. It looked like Canada does today. So a lot more evergreens. It was a lot cooler. The animals that we see today are not the animals that they were seeing, but they were hunters and gatherers. They lived in small groups of 25 to 30 people, family units, and they were moving across the landscape, packing with them what they needed. They did have beasts of burden, dogs, and of course, essentially you had your family unit. Many of the items that we have found are only the stone. Every so often, we'll find bone or antler tools. The rest of this is based on our speculation of how things were back then. We're moving, obviously, very quickly through these time frames. The Archaic period is one of the longest periods in human history here in the U.S. Hunters and gatherers still, but they were coming together along rivers, i.e., like this one outside, and forming a little bit larger villages. So you still had many people grouping together in family units, but the groups were larger. You were taking advantage of all of the fauna and flora in the area. So fish, turtles, so aquatic species were being used, as well as some of the other smaller, like deer and turkey and bear. Those were being, at this point, being hunted. The temperature had changed, the climate had changed drastically, so they started having hardwood forests and deciduous forests like we have today. So in the Archaic period, it started looking a little bit more like what we see today between here and like if you walk out at Cove Springs, that's closer to what they were living in. They did have basketry back then, and if you're thinking about the artistic merit of folks 8,000 or it'd be 10,000 years ago now. These people imbued everything with art. Even if it was a very functional tool, it was still had this artistic sense to it. Here on the right, you have some stone points. You have a string of bone beads. You have a gorget or a big pendant. You have a slate, addle weight. A lot of people call some of these other ones a birdstone. This is an addle weight. This is an addle weight, and addle is a spear thrower. This is the piece of equipment that's been used through human history more than any other weapon. These are the critters that they were hunting at this point, ones that are very familiar with us today, hopefully not in front of your car, but, and that's what we see. We do have elk back in Kentucky, bear are coming back, and deer and turkey have been here forever and a day. Also, for the gathering, most of the food actually was gathered and not hunted, because when you're gathering something, trees are not going to run away from you or try to maul you to death. The guys had the harder job in hunting because they were not always successful, but about 85% of the food came from gathering. Part of that was from things that, again, you go out to Cove Springs, you see frequently. Lots of types of berries, lots of types of nuts, hazelnuts, hickory nuts, black walnuts, not the English walnut. And you had a lot of fruiting plants as well. No apples, but crab apples, yes, plums. Actually, I have a picture of acorns here. You can eat acorns. You just have to process them a little more than some of the larger nuts. They were using nets, traps, fish hooks and lines way back then. They were doing quite a bit of harvesting all the way around their entire environment. So living right on a river, like here in Frankfort, gave them a huge advantage in being able to trap and fish out of a large waterway and not just smaller creeks. You'll notice the two guys that are carrying the deer, he's got an addle in his belt. You also notice some of these folks are not wearing animal hides. There's a reason for that, because they were also at this point creating fabric. That's an addle. The addle is the spear thrower, the wooden part that has the hook on the back. So you were hunting bear and deer and turkey with this tool. The bow and arrow had not been developed yet. So frequently people call these arrowheads. They're spear points because the arrow hadn't been developed yet, unless you call an addle arrow, but usually they're spears. So these spear points can be anywhere from 2 inches up to 6 or 8 inches, depending on what you were hunting. These are some of the tools that were made out of bone. So again, we're looking at people that if they were dressed like we are today, you would not be able to distinguish them from anybody else. These are just human beings living their life. They did have dogs. We know that they treated their dogs as pets as well as partners, because we found dog burials that have flowers and stuff in the burial. So, they treated theirs pretty much like we treat ours. But we're talking about fishing and the use of artwork. One of the other things, this is further west of here in Mammoth Cave. These folks were explorers and miners in Mammoth Cave. Just to let you know how kind of extensive their world was. They have been in every part of Mammoth Cave that has, to this date, been explored. So anywhere where contemporary scientists have been in Mammoth Cave, they have found these people were there before them 10,000 years ago. So just saying. So this is the period that is just preceding when Europeans come in. So the life here is very much what you may have think about in some of the historical fiction like Alan Eckert's work and things like that. So just prior to Europeans coming in and the changes that happened because of European contact, both one-to-one contact and through trade, this is just prior to that. So these folks were living in larger villages. They had started gardening, and this was a huge change from being able to only rely on what you could find in season and having to move from place to place to find that material. Now you started gardening. The Eastern Kentucky and part of Central Kentucky is one of the world hearths of plant domestication. So there are 6 places around the world where plants were domesticated, and essentially Eastern Kentucky is one of them. And that knowledge was disseminated outward from Eastern Kentucky west. So this would have been fairly quick to get that new technology. Again, some of the artifacts that these people produced, again, not just functional, but really beautiful. These are some of the things that they were growing, things that I pull out of my garden all the time as noxious weeds. Goosefoot, maygrass, erect knotweed, amaranth. This is little barley, and I'm missing one. I can't remember what the other one is. But these are both oily and starchy seeds, so it provided a really good nutritional basis. These are what they were growing much later in this period. So lamb's quarter, marsh elder, sunflowers, big, still, and squash have always been in Kentucky. They're a native plant, and they're the winter squashes, not the like yellow squash you get at Kroger. So Wycliffe Mounds, and it has one of the best preserved examples of some of the housing in the western part of the state. In the eastern part of the state, we have a lot less than that, simply because of the way that the history and the environment has kind of treated it. If you have dry rock shelters, you have preserved material. If you do not, anything that rots is going to be gone, and the only thing that you're going to have left are stone, maybe a little bit of bone, but probably not, ceramics, clay, and that's what Wycliffe Mounds shows us. So across the state, along the river courses, right through here on the Kentucky River, this bottom panel shows a trading kind of scene. These people were consummate traders. Right on the rivers, they could not only contact different people, but control the trade that happened up and down the river. A little bit east of here, like on the eastern side of Kentucky, which does include the bluegrass mostly, you had large villages, palisaded walls, large crop fields outside. About 700-800 years ago is when the bow and arrow developed. We know for a fact then that people were creating very complicated patterns in their fabrics from plant material. They did not have cotton, but they were using a variety of other sorts of fibers to make cloth. Some of them very complicated in plaids, in color, and in the design elements in the weaving. So you had some of this type of material going on. This is a copper traded in, the blade and the bracelets. This is a pipe and a tablet, and then the piece of fabric that's been found in a rock shelter in eastern Kentucky. Again, all of this technology was spread across the state. So people here in Frankfort would have been producing some of the same types of things. Now, this is a term that's come to be not used. Prehistory means before history. Unless it's pre-people, it's not prehistory. So this is just in the history from 10,000 to 1600 AD. So this is a slide that will be changed probably in the next day or two. So anyway, hunter-gatherer farmers, these people had huge fields of corn, beans, and squash outside of their palisaded villages. Their houses were sometimes round and sometimes square. We know that because of the posts. The post holes leave basically marks in the dirt. When archaeologists go in, you can see where a post hole was. And a lot of times you find when somebody's filled in a post hole with trash, you find really kind of cool goodies. And so we know what these people were eating, what they were doing, what they were making. And the whole corn, beans, and squash, what's called the Three Sisters, a lot of people say that all together like they showed up all at one time. They didn't show up all at one time. They're sisters, but there's a middle sister, an older sister, and a younger sister. Okay? The oldest aged sister is the squash. She's the old sister. The corn is the middle sister, and the beans are the youngest sister. The corn, actually, when it first came into this area, was used only in ceremony. It was not used as a dietary supplement, as it were, to begin with, and then it became a huge portion of their diet. Yeah. And some of the beans that you find, the heirloom beans that you find in Kentucky, are some of these old ones, which is pretty cool. You have just a little bit east of us a circular crescent mound outside of Lexington. That's the closest one that I'm familiar with that you can visit today. And these were ceremonial mounds. People did not live immediately surrounding them, maybe a quarter of a mile, half a mile away. There were large villages. These were villages of hundreds of people. So huge communities here in central Kentucky with huge, all of the government, all of the religious what's the word I'm looking for? Systems in place. So these folks were quite civilized, to use the term that a lot of people did not use with them. Right along the Kentucky River, we have found hunting camps that folks would leave the main village and go to a hunting camp for a couple of months, and they would basically start packing their larder. Their larders were dried meat, since there was no other way to preserve it. But they were producing, when they started gardening and farming, they could settle down in one spot, so they started producing ceramics, not only to cook in, to store things in, and we have fantastic examples of the ceramics that are produced here in central Kentucky and a little bit east. You can see down on the left corner is a view of basically one of the villages, what a village would have looked like, with some of its government and religious dignitaries there up on one of the mounds. Now, at this point, people were using bows and arrows, so an arrowhead looks more like the ones pictured there. They don't have a stem. Generally speaking, that's an easy difference to distinguish between arrowheads and spear points, as these are arrowheads. They're much younger than any of the other ones that you may find. And this is a freshwater shell pulled out of the river, and it has this facial design that's been carved in it that we've seen this design in a lot of different areas, but again, this art has just, it travels with people. I mean, people are just artistic, whether on functional pieces or a piece like this that is wholly decorative. Into the historic era, these images are from John White in the 1600s in Virginia. This is the closest that we have of European documentation or illustration of what the people there look like, understanding that he was working from a certain kind of sensibility in the artistic world of how you draw people. So this may not be exactly how these people looked, because his school of art basically taught him to put a little bit more flesh on people that he was painting. So there are images that you can find that have been kind of corrected for that, for his this style of artwork, but we know that they were wearing fabrics that they had a variety of hairstyles, that they were still hunting, gathering, and farming at the time that Europeans got here. Now, about a little bit earlier than the 1600s, there was kind of one of the reasons why the myth of no people living in Kentucky, no native people living in Kentucky started is because there were two things that happened. One is the Shawnee were here in central Kentucky for the most part. The Cherokee came in and started pressuring them to move. There was warfare between the Shawnee and the Cherokee, which kind of cleared out central Kentucky. Other things that came through were two different epidemics. One was influenza that basically decimated the native population. So that's another reason why some of the villages that some of the Europeans saw the remnants of, they were depopulated. There just weren't folks there, either because they didn't think it was safe or there weren't enough people to actually, build that or hold that community. So when the Europeans came into this area, many of the villages were desolate, right? So that's one of the reasons why the whole Indians didn't live here, they only hunted here, myth got started. And if you're going to ask a lot of settlers to come in and settle in a place, you're not going to say, yeah, but there are a lot of Indian people there, they're not going to like you coming. You're not going to say that. It's not economically advantageous for you to say, yeah, but other people own it. That doesn't happen. And that's one of the other reasons why the myth survived. This is what a Shawnee man would look like in the very late 1600s, early 1700s, already using lots of trade cloth. His leggings are actually hide leggings that have been dyed red. Moccasins, he does use lots of glass beads, a lot of silver and other metal adornment in ears, nose, bracelets, armbands. So this is the person that some of those early surveyors might have run into. And up in the corner are artifacts that have been found. These are termed historic period artifacts that have been found in different areas around the state. But if you have more need to know more, please call me. I am very willing to come and talk with you much longer about some of the other aspects of this history and bringing it up into contemporary, what's happening in the contemporary world with the Native people that are here today and some of the stereotypes that Native people today deal with. So thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you.
Our next presenter, Emily Preston, is going to be presenting on the eve of discovery, the days leading up to July 16th, 1773. She will lead us in the footsteps and ride in the canoes of the McAfee party as they make their way through the pristine wilderness to Kentucky, sit on a camp stool formed from an ancient vertebra, survive a spine-tingling buffalo stampede, and finally relax in a field of bluegrass, all just one day outside of Frankfort. Emily Preston is a Lindsey Wilson graduate, now retired from a career in public health. A longtime board member and treasurer of the James Herod Trust for Historic Preservation, she works with the research arm of the trust, documenting the lineage of historic properties. Emily gives voice to interesting Mercer County residents buried at Spring Hill Cemetery and JHT's annual cemetery tour, History Underfoot. As a member of the Harrodsburg Historical Society, she organized the renovation, which ended in 2020, of the Old Mud Meeting House, the first Dutch Reformed church west of the Alleghenies. She currently heads the Conservation Committee of the Jane McAfee chapter, the DAR, and is working to reestablish an heirloom apple, the McAfee Nonesuch, which scions from a surviving tree in the state of Washington to its home on McAfee land in Mercer County, where it was planted in 1775. Emily is also a sixth great-granddaughter of Robert McAfee. Please help me welcome Emily Preston.
Boy, I'm even impressed. Well, I'm glad that y'all invited me today. I hope you're not here for a real scholarly presentation because this comes from family. And as I got these thoughts together 2 to 3 weeks ago, my uncle's words come to mind today as I'm looking at my notes, and that is, my forgetter is working better than my rememberer. So we'll see how I do as I go along here. At any rate, that McAfee party by serendipity joined up with Hancock Taylor, and the rest is history. But I like to think, we can all, don't you remember as a child at McAfee in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And so history can just be as dry and awful as it can be. But if it's about the people, who they were, why in the world they risked life and limb to come here, and best of all in Kentucky, what they saw as they came along. I want to start before I do the talk. Do we have enough? I think we have almost enough room over there. I would like 9 people. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, 9 people volunteer to come up here because there is some rationale. If you do this, your wingspan is about the same length as your height. It is. Measure sometime. I remember my mama buying material, and to measure a yard, she would hold it to her. You know that too. Hold it to her nose and hold her hand out. So at any rate, both of your hands out, and you're going to be have the same width. I want to show y'all a tree that they would have seen as they came along. So I need 50 feet worth of people. So that would be about 9 people, 5 point something. Anybody want to dare and come up? Anybody that doesn't like it, I want you to think about the tree. Because things grew so beautifully and so wonderfully, and they grew long. So everybody join hands. Let's get, and now we need to get where we can make a circle. A circle, yes.
Oh, good deal. All right, buddy.
Now then, also spread your wings. And if we could make that circle, and we almost have, that would be the circumference of a tree that they saw existing and documented. Can you picture that? I mean, it was Eden, you all. They came into a wondrous, wondrous place that was rich. I remember in the McAfee journals at one point they talked about they had to grow crops for 4 or 5 years before they could get some of that richness out of the ground so that they didn't grow too fast and fall over and rot. Goodness gracious. Thank you all for volunteering. I just wanted to give you an idea. Well, as we said, we have this wonderful group that just happened to get together, and we're going to go back in time. And I have to say that I've mislabeled it a little bit. This is the eve of discovery. The eve is going to get extended back. There were several eves there. And so part of this is to talk about the McAfee party, because quite frankly, I want you to kind of know what motivated them into here. And so we have Robert, my ancestor. We have James, his big brother, who, where are you, Myra? James is here in the form of his 6th great granddaughter, Myra, and then brother George, and then brother-in-law, James McCown. So I'm part McCown because his wife was a McCown. So we've got about 2/3 of the survey party being represented here today. And so I think that's kind of neat. At any rate, yes, they were, the other one, the one that was not kin at all, was little Samuel Adams, and we'll talk about him later. But at any rate, they had come to Kentucky after a settled period of time in Botetourt County. But I'm going to go back across the waves because they were Scots-Irish who had been resettled into Northern Ireland, and they were living in County Armagh, Ireland. And, we just can't picture nowadays because we can only look at things through a rearview mirror, shall we say. And they were living under English rule, and that was just an absolute rule. And so what they came to realize is there's really never a chance for us to do anything on our own because they were small farmers and they were weavers. And I know, go back on Google when you go home and look up the McCown tartan and the McAfee tartan. Oh, they're beautiful. McCown's is the prettiest, I have to say. Anyway, but they were good weavers and they were successful farmers. And so the British, who were their overlords, decided We can't have them as competition. Our British farmers and weavers are having a tough time because these guys are doing better. So they come to them and they made an edict. You may not sell your produce. You may not sell your products. It didn't help to say, but how am I going to feed my family and my children? There was nothing. In their case, they had a little piece of ground, so maybe they wouldn't starve, but they realized the writing was on the wall. About that time, the dad of them all passed away. The farm was going to then be sold and divided amongst his children, and so the plans began to be made. We've got to go to that new world that we've heard about, America, where a man is his own boss. And so they got the plans together. That was in 1739. Now, your James had already been born. He was a little boy on board the boat that came over. And so across the pond they came, docked in Delaware. And I have to, and now this is where y'all are going to have to follow me, because I have to, things that are interesting I have to throw in. This was one of the funnier things that, if you want to call it funny, that could go along with this. I worked for several years with Harriet Coyle, whose husband was Jim Coyle, and Jim was a James, not a James, but a Robert McAfee descendant. And so they had a son, Shane. Aren't those nice Irish names? So Shane was college age, and he was working every summer. And this particular summer, he had gotten a job as a camp counselor somewhere down in the Carolinas. So he's down there working, and just by happenstance, two young Irish men were working their way across the United States, and they were working there as camp counselors. They got to be fast friends. And so when the camp was over with and they're all ready to head back to school, they still had plenty of time. So the Irish boy says, well, we're going home, Shane. You come with us and we'll show you Ireland. And he thought that was a good idea. But his mama said, okay, Shane, you can go. But they're from County Armagh. That's where the McAfees came from. When you get there, see if there's still any McAfees left, or at least see if there's any of their stone houses, because the old stone houses in Mercer County that ultimately the McAfees built that are still standing were supposed to look like the houses they left behind in Ireland. So Shane goes over there, of course, being Shane. They have the best old time, and he's about to come home and realizes he hasn't done what his mama told him. So he accosted these boys. He said, listen, my mama's going to kill me. I have to ask you this. Are there still any McAfees in Ireland? And if so, are there stone houses still here? And he said, this is how they replied. They went, you're a McAfee? He said, my mama says so. They said, you know you're not quite human. And he said, what? And he said, oh, the McAfees, they descend from the Silkies, those seal women that the seals can come up out of the ocean on a full moon. I can balance a ball on my nose. And at any rate, supposedly they can cohabitate with humans. And so the McAfees, according to the current Irish people over there, say that the McAfees are part Irish. So see how distinguished I am? You get a descendant of Robert McAfee and a descendant of a pinniped. So I love that tale. I had to share it with you all because it's not all seriousness, shall we say. But bless their hearts, on the boat they came to Delaware. Well, of course, the East Coast, as we know already, by 1739, the good land was taken up. And so I think they hit up into the up backwoods, if you will, of Pennsylvania, hack out a farm that's never going to be productive. And so Daddy and his wife, Jane McMichael McAfee, and the kids head on down through Virginia, eventually into the Carolinas. Nothing is working out. Hacking a new farm. How did they do it? Hacking a new farm out of the wilderness and moving on. So finally ending up in Botetourt County, Virginia, and that's where these boys were growing up to manhood. Well, it was a great place to be because you've got trails crisscrossing there, you've got the long hunters, you've got Native Americans. They're getting a real feel for this land that they have come to. And by now more were being born. And so it's my understanding that there would be inns, and the long hunters were already out there that had been in Kentucky, so they could hear about these tales. And of course, we all know that propaganda one from, I figure, land speculators and developers, and that is, you know, heaven must be a Kentucky kind of place. And I really think that it is, because I live on the cliffs above the Kentucky River, and you know, I've lived in the same house all of my life, and here I go off on one of my tangents. Every morning, the great blue herons get up out of their roost and come circling up and then fan out across the country to go to ponds and go fishing and things. And I thought, your generations, you've been down there since the beginning of time, so to speak. I just love it that I'm there with the people and the flora and the fauna that shared the place. At any rate, so I finally have gotten, I'm sorry guys, I've finally gotten the McAfees in Virginia. The boys are hearing these tales and they come home at night and they're all talking. They have their separate households now. Their families are starting to grow and they're talking. We're never going to make it here. We've just got these tiny little farms just clinging to the sides of the hills, and they're not going to be productive. So we hear about this land to the west. Let's give it a look-see. So that was all going on about 1770 through 1772. They're making plans. And so finally, in May of 1773, being practical sorts, and they always are, the plans were made. They had been accumulating and packing what they were going to bring with them. They also knew that they were coming by river, and so they have to intersect with a river that will intersect with the Ohio, and that is the Kanawha in what's now West Virginia. So at any rate, on the given day, wait a minute, I was talking about the practical aspect of it. They made sure to stay in Virginia till they got their crops in, so the crops could be in and growing and be there for when they got back. And of course, the wives could take care of that, couldn't they? And actually, I wish Luther Davenport were here. Y'all don't know Luther, but he was a McAfee, and he tracked their military exploits, and he just said, they're such good logical people. If there was going to be a campaign that they had to go out on, it was in shifts. So there would always be a group that went out to fight with the fight, and there was a group to defend. And so it was this way. Some were left at home, some were sent over the mountain. So anyway, so we're picturing this. They're accumulating the things that they're bringing with them. They've also decided to bring Samuel Adams, who was just a kid. He maybe had turned 19. I mean, the new hadn't even worn off of him. And so they're there, they're getting ready to leave, and his mama comes over and prays over the whole group. She says, oh, let the divine providence bring them back, because she hated sending that little boy off with those rough and tumble McAfees to the frontier. But that's what they did. So the day of departure, they had asked another one of the McCowns, John McCown, and let me see who. Oh, it was the Pauling, James Pauling. And by the way, all of these names ended up here in Kentucky. At any rate, they were to ride along with them and bring back the horses, because they were coming by, going to come here by water. They didn't need the pack horses. They just needed it to get their supplies over there. So they intersect with the Kanawha, about 120 miles above its confluence with the Ohio River. And so the horses and the friends leave, and they're there in the middle of the wilderness. And this is the other thing. I love the resilience. Again, we know how well trees, and still do, the trees that are in a forest grow tall and straight before they leaf out. So they were able to pick the very best trees, because they're going to make dugout canoes. And so they chose two, did dugout canoes. Can you picture ones that we would make nowadays? If you didn't get them perfectly hollowed and balanced, slide them into the river and let them turn over and dump everything. But they were able to make fine dugout canoes. There's no record of what size they were. They were often like maybe 30 feet long, maybe 3 feet wide, and it was recorded that they could easily hold 2 to 3 tons of cargo. They were a very practical piece of transportation, shall we say. So they probably worked about 2 weeks and got the canoes ready to go, and then launched, and here we go out the Kanawha toward the Ohio. So there's 120 miles of that by canoe to go. And so that's what they do. And I'm going to interject these things as I go along. Just think about camping out on the way. Again, you are in the middle of the trackless forest. Hundreds of miles of trees in every direction. I want to tell you, the air and the oxygen would have to be good enough to eat. I think you would just feel good breathing. And so I think that's wonderful. Maybe you would wake up one morning and hear a commotion going on in the trees. Did y'all? I'm sure you all did, because I can tell you know more than I do about this. We had an American parrot, the Carolina parakeet. And so, yeah, look up Audubon, because he painted some before we killed them all. And at any rate, but they would come in flocks of hundreds. And of course, once there got to be, quote, civilization, if they came into your orchard, you had no food for the rest of the year because they could clean out an entire forest or garden or cornfield in no time. But I've seen pictures and they were beautiful, iridescent green. So that would have been so neat. Or the other thing, and I'm not sure, this may have been too late for the annual migration of the passenger pigeon, and we all know about them. But they tell me that literally you could just take your gun, point it straight up, and shoot, and your supper fell to the ground below you. And the thing that I like, again, is talking to people who knew of it or whose parents knew of it. And an old gentleman at our church, Philip Durr, said, "Oh, Emily, I could take you over in Washington County to pigeon roost." Because when the passenger pigeons came through, that they had regular stops apparently, and that was one of them. And he says, you know, so many generations, and I don't know how to politely say this, had excrement there, that the pH of the ground was so that, I know he's filming, was so that lots of times vegetation didn't grow under it, and trees were deadened. He said that they would be so many of them landing in the trees that the boughs would break. So again, the wonders that they saw as far as the animal kingdom goes are unbelievable. And then it is recorded that they had packed their fishing gear and that kind of thing because they couldn't pack enough food to do for 2 months. They knew they were going to have to live off the land, and they were all good hunters. And so that happened, and without too much problem. And so they were able to fish. And, you know, I'm looking around, a friend of mine, Fred Goins, you're not here, are you? I'm going to get him. He lives here in Frankfort, and he had said he'd be here. He told me a story one time of down here in Frankfort when they were working on the lock and the dam, rather, and the divers had gone down because there were holes and they were having to repair the concrete on the face of the dam. And the diver got to feeling kind of funny, like somebody's looking over my shoulder. And he looked around, and there was a 100-pound catfish, almost as big as him, hovering in the water. So even recently, we've had some big fish here. But the McAfees do record pulling big fish from the streams to eat on. Okay, I'm never going to get them out the Kanawha River, am I? So they keep heading down through there, and finally getting closer to June now, because they're well through the month of June. They're about 1 day out from the mouth of the river. They go to camp, and they hear other people, and they've happened upon Hancock Taylor and Captain Thomas Bullitt, and they were both heading for the same place. They all get to talking. Let's just throw in together, shall we say. And so 1 day out, they get to the mouth of the Ohio, and soon after, Captain Bullitt, of course, thought that he had a mission and headed off to Chillicothe to talk to the Indians, the Shawnee, and eventually came back with letters of intent and all of that kind of thing. And I weren't here for yours, Tressa, but I'm sure that we know maybe it wasn't worth the paper it was written on because of the very different concepts of land ownership. But we won't go there. All I'm doing is stating what went on. So Bullitt and some of his party went off overland to Chillicothe, and Hancock stayed with the McAfees. And so they're slowly working their way down the Ohio River. And as they do it, of course, they have to take turns off finding food, of course, and just happen to looking, you know, what is the good land eventually? Is this someplace we would want to be? But we're still bound for Kentucky, if you will. So they're heading down the river, and I'm going to stop and look at my notes here because my forgetter is kicking in. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, I thought it was neat to say here that it was mentioned by the McAfees, so you can picture Hancock Taylor. Do y'all know what a Jacob's staff is? See, I've always pictured, this whole time that I thought of him having that, he's walking through the forest. Jacob's staff has to be that big crook thing that you pull the sheep back in with. It's not. It's a surveying tool. It's metered off, and you put it down, put a compass on top, and you've got your reading for your line that you do. So he has his Jacob's staff with him. So bear that in mind too. Okay, so June the 1st, they've traveled together, and Bullet has gone off, and so it takes about 2 weeks for Bullet to, and you all, they didn't have cell phones. How in this world did they meet back up? But they did. I'm assuming there was some sort of landmark that Bullet had said, I'll meet you at such and such creek or something, because he was there, and they meet back up with him. So that was on June 13th. And so the whole last weeks of June are coming up, and the clock is ticking toward our great Frankfort Day. They're continuing down the Ohio. They weren't having any trouble keeping food on the table. There was just such an abundance of wildlife. And again, this is when they saw the big tree. And let's see, there's a Norse journal that also records the big tree. And I often think about that, you all. We're all in the same room, sharing the same air. But at that point in time, you were breathing air that hadn't been in an animal or a human's nose for hours or days or more. I think about this when I'm working in my flower garden and a car goes past where somebody is smoking and they have their window down, and literally the car isn't out of past hardly before you smell the smoke. And so I think that's how fast someone else's breath is in my nose, even out in the country. But they didn't have that at all. Well, June fades away as they're making their way down the Ohio. So it's July 2nd and 3rd, 1773. They're still up around northern Kentucky. And they realize that they have paddled past Big Bone Lick. They'd already heard about Big Bone Lick, and they wanted to see it. And it meant enough to them that they turned those big old dugouts around and paddled against the stream, against the current. And that wouldn't have been too easy. It was easy to float with the current, but to come back upriver to go to Big Bone Lick. Oh my goodness, how amazing was that? They walk overland to where it is, and they actually camped out there. And there was, they recorded a 70-year-old Delaware Indian was there, who apparently was camped out as well, that they had good conversations with. And I suspect, now this is my take on it, if you was traveling into new land, a totally foreign land, and you come upon this place where there are skeletons of animals, and they're huge, because when they camped out, they were, said, they sat on vertebrae that were camp stools. They used ribs to support their tents. So you're seeing an animal this huge, and you're thinking, when we get a little further down the river, is there going to be one with meat on, walk out of the forest? So they were quite anxious to talk to the Delaware Indian, and he assured them that it had been the same ever since he was a small child. Always this, they're dead, you're not going to meet any more of them. But wow, what a scene that was there at the lick. And so, of course, then the clock is really ticking. It's on. They stayed there for quite some time, and it's like the 7th, and they're heading downriver. And again, they know where they're going. And I tell you, they know where they're going because both Bullitt and Hancock Taylor had already made trips down the river. They would have known lots of the landmarks and that kind of thing. So they're heading for the Kentucky River, the Lavisa. And again, clock's ticking. It's July 8th, and at daylight, they reach the mouth of the Kentucky River. Well, again, Bullitt is off and on his way, and I've often wondered if there were any words between him and Hancock, because Bullitt is off to fulfill his mission, which is to survey the falls of the Ohio, Louisville. And so he and most of his party go on toward the falls of the Ohio, and Hancock Taylor stays with the McAfees. Remarkably good taste. And at any rate, and so they head up the Lavisa, up the Kentucky. And there again, of course, and I don't think I even said this to you all, I get all of this from Robert B. McAfee's journal. He accumulated his uncle's and his dad's journals and combined them for this nice long recounting of what went on in their lives. And we're so blessed. At my previous commitment up in Owenston, I said, is there really going to be evidence of us, because all of ours is parked in the cloud on a thumb drive that we may not keep up with? And I still do like the fact that there are some papers out there that can be leafed through and read. So at any rate, they're coming up the Kentucky. One of the first, they named the creek that they passed was Eagle Creek. And of course, because eagles galore circling over the mouth of the creek. And let me see, did they camp there? I think they did. Yep. and then on up past that, the next day, they realized that Drennan's Lick, they had heard of it, and they wanted to go to Drennan's. And also, their canoes were big, and Drennan's Lick Creek had filled the Kentucky River with a great big sandbar, and they were going to have trouble getting the canoes past it. At this point, Robert Beach says, as near as I can tell, they parked the dugouts and never used them again because they're never mentioned again. And so they head overland to Drennan's in Henry County. Now this was, they didn't go on and on about it, but you could tell there was some rancor. When they got up there, they realized someone else was there. Some of Bullitt's group had gone renegade, at least 2 men, and were up there surveying for themselves, and there was supposed to be an understanding as to where the two groups would all be surveying. So a little bit aggravated there. We're also not sure, but the next account, oh my goodness. First of all, just the picture of Drennan's Lick at the time, it was such a wonderful mineral and salt source that animals of every variety, they were seeing herds of buffalo, elk, deer, wolves, beaver, just about anything that could exist in Kentucky was there to get the minerals and the salt. As a result, of course, it had been generations of that, and the land was beaten down. It was literally, they likened some of the buffalo paths coming in as to the best roads of the bigger cities of Virginia that you could walk in on. So they were amazed by that, and even though the other surveyors were there, they thought, well, we need to check out this land. This may be the place that we want to come. And so they were checking it out. Well, then, Myra, you have to realize that you're very fortunate to be here because this next part of the story involves your James McAfee. Okay, little Samuel, Samuel Adams and James were out at the forefront. They weren't all staying together, you know, and someone, could it be those renegades, fired off a gun and spooked the bison, the buffalo, and there was a stampede, just like you saw in the old westerns. Well, little Samuel was young and strong, and there was a leaning mulberry tree, and they said he scampered up it like a raccoon and held on for dear life. James was the oldest brother, maybe a little thicker in the middle. He couldn't scamper up a tree, and so he saw one that was, 2 feet wide. Now, I'm telling you what, 2 feet wide in the middle of a buffalo stampede is no place to be, but behind it he got, sucked it up, held on for dear life, and after the stampede was over and the other brothers came running thinking, we'll just find them in shreds, they're going to be dead. When they came over there, he stepped out from behind the tree. They examined the tree. It was totally scrubbed raw by the horns of the bison as they went past on both sides. He barely found cover in behind that tree to survive the stampede. And I will tell you, my grandmother, who was not a McAfee, used to tell, she was a great storyteller. She would tell the best tales about 5th great grandfather Bishop's horse bolting just in time to keep the panther from jumping out of the tree and getting him, and things like, oh, great stories. There's great stories back there. But at any rate, apparently this was one of those great stories that they entertained each other with around the campfires, making fun of James, of course. But what Granny would end her story with when a ancestor was miraculously spared like that, she would say, and if it wasn't for that horse, you wouldn't be here. Now, she didn't know a thing about DNA. She just knew if that person had been taken out of your line, you wouldn't be here. And so that's really amazing to think about at times. Okay, I'm off the track. We're headed to Frankfort, for crying out loud. Okay, they did continue till July the 15th up there, and again are checking out whether they want to make surveys there. I will say, if you think about the layout of the river, not far away is Elkhorn Creek, and they're again in the Norse Journal, and it looks like they are talking about Elkhorn. Now, I know that bluegrass is not native to here, but in 1773 there were already great pastures of it on the highlands above Elkhorn Creek. So that's all I'm telling you. In 1773, it was a well-established plant in Kentucky. Okay, that's all I got to say. Okay, then July 15th, 1773, early in the morning, they left Drennan's. Now, they're not going to use the what are those things, canoes. And so I've tried to kind of look at, how did they get to where they were going? And of course, it was on foot. And so they would have walked all the way through the county and partially into Franklin County, because and you all know, these are athletes. They walked 30 miles in one day. They tracked themselves. 30 miles, you all. I don't even know where to is 30 miles. But I did look up, and you know, there are athlete walkers, if you will, and that is a competition. And so the very best are lucky to make it the 30 miles. So I'm impressed with the McAfees and company. And so they, again, camped, and that way they only had one more day to head down. And so that next morning was July 16th. They walked 5 more miles to where a buffalo path crossed the Kentucky River at Lock 4, isn't that where Jim's Seafood is now? So that's where they got out of course, they had already been walking through Franklin County. That's way down into Franklin County. But that's where they crossed the river into what would be the Big Bottom that would be Frankfort, Kentucky. And so the deed was done. They were there. Well, July 16th, Hancock Taylor and Robert McAfee surveyed 2 plats, one of 400 acres, the other of 200 acres. And since I knew I wouldn't remember what to say, I'm going to read it to you. These surveys included the whole of the Penitentiary Valley, and so y'all who are from Frankfort can be picturing this. Is the Penitentiary Valley where the Department of Transportation big building is? Yeah. So anyway, the whole of the Penitentiary Valley in the town of Frankfort, except the low ground north of the Capitol Square, as well as the spring known as McAfee Spring. Does anybody know, is McAfee Spring still in Frankfort? It's what? Oh, okay, okay. Cool, all right. So they camped that night about where the Capitol stands under a large beech tree. This was the 16th of July, Friday, 1773, which was the first survey ever made on the Kentucky River. And my father, and I will go ahead and say this because Candy already knows it, he never completed title to the land. And many years later, he said he didn't do it because he thought others, it had been so long. Okay, they didn't get to come to stay in 1773. They went back to Virginia. They were able to come back and make sure that their surveys, even in Mercer County, were sticking. And that's how the apple tree that I mentioned got here, because they brought apples with them and stuck the seeds in the ground. And by the time they got back in 79 to settle permanently, those seeds had grown into trees that had apples on them. I mean, gosh. So again, the ground was rich. So anyway, in that intervening time, there were many things going on having to do with the Revolutionary War, et cetera. They got tied up in Virginia. They didn't get back to 1779. And Robert just assumed surely in that time somebody had gotten that wonderful Big Bottom, so he never did the paperwork. Candy will tell us who got it, because the McAfees did not. And therefore, with all of my ramblings, I hope y'all have halfway followed me, and that is the first recorded history of the land that would become Frankfort, Kentucky. And mind you, I said recorded. And further, I say not. Any questions? I'm telling you, it was wonderful stories. It's wonderful stories to read. And, you know, we can't second guess people. We often try to, but we judge through the lens and the filter of how we feel now and what we know now. And they were operating under a totally different set of circumstances at the time. And so I'm very proud to have the McAfees in my background, because I find them, as a general rule, to be honorable people. Okay, I'm definitely sitting down now, if there's no questions.
Our final presentation for the afternoon comes from Candy Atkinson. She will be presenting Land Patents in Frankfort, Kentucky, and the history and fundamentals of the patenting process. This will include a discussion of land patents depicted on Willard Rouse Gilson's patent map of downtown Frankfort. Candy Atkinson is the Administrative Section Supervisor in the Land Office Section of the Office of the Secretary of State. Please help me to welcome Candy Atkinson.
Appreciate that. It's a pleasure being here today, and I want to compliment the program planners, because this is a natural segue into where we need to be with the patenting process. But first of all, I'd like to send you greetings from Secretary of State Michael Adams. Our office is in the Land Office Division in the Capitol Annex. We work the regular state hours, 8 to 4:30. Contact information is on the back of your PowerPoint handout. We do urge you to make an appointment, if you can, to come and see the records. You do not have to go to Virginia to see the old pre-statehood records. They're in our office and have been since the late 1700s. But even more exciting is that they're online with no membership fee, except for certain series that we're working on. Secretary Adams has hired a wonderful young man, Travis Horn, to resurrect our scanning program so that we can get these things ready for you to research. Your introduction, literally, to the patenting process was excellent, my friend Emily, with whom I graduated from high school several years ago. Anyway, did you ever go see the outdoor drama, The Legend of Daniel Boone, at Fort Herod? There was a scene that was for comedy relief that actually captured the dilemma that those McAfees and every settler faced when it came to land acquisition. It was a little break between the torch throwing and the marriages and the music and the dancing. And two men were on stage with a Jacob staff. One man said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm getting ready to stake a claim." "Well, how are you going to file it? Are you going to file it with the king and be a traitor? Or are you going to file it with a surveying company and risk losing it all?" The other man responded, "I'm going to file it with both. I'm going to file it with both to be on the safe side." So the question becomes, for any attorney that may be in here or watching this program, who has the right to give you clear title to a piece of land? The answer is the one who owns it. This gentleman. King George III of England is going to decide how land would be appropriated on this side of the water. But now that didn't stop the surveying companies, the Mississippi Company, the Transylvania Company, the Ohio Company, the Loyalist Company from coming in to explore. Perhaps some were even commissioned by the king to do so. But they didn't have the right to sign over a deed because this land was his. He would set up a process. What happened? Did we go too far? There we go. In 1763, King George III of England signed a proclamation that solved two dilemmas that he had. First of all, he needed a way to remind settlers and surveying companies that he was in charge. He also needed a way to pay soldiers who had fought for him in the French and Indian War. And that is a pretty slick trick because he's putting soldiers, veterans, against those surveying companies. The proclamation line, according to the 1763 edict, required settlers to stay east. Everything west of the proclamation line was reserved for the Native Americans. But everybody knew eventually we're going to be having a war. So that didn't stop them from coming in and staking claims for land that might eventually be theirs. Perhaps even the king will go on ahead and say, it's okay to cross that line. Look at the number of treaties that had been negotiated on the western side. That also gave the residents a feeling that maybe it'll be okay if we move westward. Because as Emily said, who wants to come here for 50 acres? We want to go west. Let's take a look at one of the provisions of that proclamation. To every person having the rank of a field officer, he was going to allow them to have a warrant of 5,000 acres. To every captain, 3,000 acres. To every subaltern or staff officer, 2,000 acres. To every non-commissioned officer, 200 acres. To every private man, 50 acres. He was being very generous with the land in that proclamation of 1763, even though he was limiting the use of those warrants to the eastern side of the line. These would be the veterans of the French and Indian War and Lord Dunmore's War. Common sense would tell us he's not going to give warrants to people who fought in the Revolutionary War against him, right? Okay. There's not a soul in this room that doesn't know that Kentucky is a daughter of Virginia. After the Revolutionary War was fought and won, the colonies were allowed to develop their own system of land appropriation. Virginia set apart an area in western Kentucky as a place for usage of Revolutionary War warrants. The Carolinas used an area in eastern Tennessee. Now, my poor old Samuel Britton from New Jersey couldn't get a bounty land warrant because New Jersey was landlocked. There was no western frontier for the men who had fought from New Jersey, even though they settled in Kentucky. The only military warrants that could be used in Kentucky's military district for Revolutionary War veterans were for veterans who had served out of Virginia. And we'll see that in just a moment. Kentucky's original 3 counties. When we're studying Kentucky history, it is imperative that we remember that this has not always been Franklin County. On the map in the preceding slide, we saw that Virginia claimed from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, except for 2 Native American areas we're going to see on a map in a few minutes. It was too big. Too big. You couldn't go to the courthouse and resolve your litigation in one day's horseback ride. So General Clark and Captain Jones petitioned Virginia for a breakup of these counties. So we have Fincastle County formed in 1772. Then Kentucky County, Virginia was formed in 1776. We've got to be aware that Montgomery County, which is going to drop down into modern-day Virginia, as well as Washington County, they're not the same counties that we have within our borders today. That Washington County is not the same Washington County county seat Springfield. That Montgomery County seat is not the same as we have in Mount Sterling. In 1780, Kentucky County District, or Kentucky County, Virginia, was divided into the big 3. We have Fayette County, county seat Lexington, Lincoln County, county seat Harrodsburg, and Jefferson County, county seat Louisville. They all converge in one place. Can anybody take a guess? Frankfort, where Benson Creek flows into the Kentucky River. It's where all 3 counties come together. You can take a walk along the pathway, the sidewalk, behind Farmers Market. Take a stroll down there, and you're going to see Benson Creek coming in. You're going to be in what was Fayette County. If you look to the left, that is old Lincoln County. If you look to the right, that is old Jefferson County. In 1795, Franklin County was formed out of, here we go, bear with me, going to be formed out of Woodford County, daughter of Fayette, Mercer County, daughter of Lincoln, and Shelby County, daughter of Jefferson. Now I'm going to stand right here. I am now in Fincastle County, Kentucky County, Fayette County, Woodford County, Franklin County, and I haven't moved a toe. The sad thing is, the records did not descend to the daughter counties. So if you research your county formation dates and suddenly your county records drop off the map, you're going to have to hit a mother county and maybe even a grandmother county to find transactions. There's a 4-step process in patenting land. Now, this is the same process that King George III had used to appropriate land with his blessing. Either it was a king's grant or one by the governor's grant. And you know what? We fought this war with them to get into a system of our own making. We adopted the same system. We like that governmental appropriation. The first step is the warrant that authorizes step 2. It can be a military warrant, a certificate of settlement, a preemption warrant, a treasury warrant. What in the world is that? A warrant issued for finding salt or clearing a road, poor widow's warrant, purchase from the land office, purchase from the county court. It can even be authorized by special legislation for the relief of certain poor persons, or establishing academies and seminaries. No land was appropriated yet. This is just, as Dr. Thomas Clark would say, your hunting license. Go find something that is both vacant and unappropriated, not just vacant. Warrants may be assigned. They may be used in whole or part. Brigadier General George Rogers Clark's military warrant authorized, I think, 11 or 12 different patents. He got 10,000 acres for his service, but he divided it up. Again, warrants do not convey title. Second step, I'm going to file an entry with the county surveyor reserving a certain tract that I've selected that appears to be unappropriated. I'm going to stake my claim. I'm going to file an entry with the county surveyor's book, and then that way, when the weather's good or when I've paid my fees, the county surveyor can go out and do the field survey. If he can't make it, then he'll appoint a deputy to go. I'm going to tell an example. Stuart Sanders back there, you like chocolate pie, don't you, Stuart? I thought you did. I could tell it. All right. There is one last piece of chocolate pie in the refrigerator. And you make an announcement in your family that you're calling dibs on that chocolate pie because
My wife loves chocolate pie. That would never happen.
Well, all right. I'm going to reverse this. Jenny calls dibs on that last piece of chocolate pie. Jenny has run into Danville for something, and you see that chocolate pie, and you're tempted, but you don't do anything yet. Last piece. She comes back and says, Jenny, what would it take for you to split that piece of pie with me? Amend your dibs. Go in and change your mind about that. I know you, and she's out, you're probably not going to get it. Okay. All right, now, how much would it take, Jenny, for you to sell me that last piece of pie? I really want that property because it has a nice water course that runs through my farm. Okay. No deal. So, in the dead of night, Stuart goes into the kitchen and he raids the refrigerator and he takes that last piece of chocolate pie. It's yours now. Now, Jenny can either take you to court over that because you jumped her claim that she had already decided was hers, or she can move to Missouri. Right. This is how a lot of these little land arguments happened. This is how they happen. An entry is not binding. It's just a reservation until a field survey can be made. Someone could come in and say, look, I already own part of that. You're going to have to amend your entry. Part of it's mine. They would have to work that out. Entries did not convey title. They just called dibs on Jenny's chocolate pie. That's what it was. That's how it worked. Nothing yet. That's step 2. Step 3. It's time for the surveyor to go to the field. He's going to take some people with him, his surveying party, and he is going to measure off the tract, write a description, and draw a plat. The survey may be done, it may be recorded in the surveyor's book, but no title has yet been conveyed. The description will identify the type of warrant or warrants being used, the name of the person for whom the survey is being made, the closest water course, and some of them in Lexington say Ohio River. Right, we didn't quite get it straight there. Meets and bounds description, surveyor, deputy surveyor, chain carriers, housekeeper, pilot, director, marker, magnetic variation, and date of survey. Kentucky is measured in meets and bounds. Meets, distance, bounds to a point. There is only one area in Kentucky that is mapped by the public method of surveying, and that's the Jackson Purchase. Townships, ranges, and sections. I was talking to a lady from Pike County, and I said it would be so much easier if the whole state had been mapped by ranges, townships, and sections. She said, honey, come on down to Pike County and tell me how you're going to do that. Are you going to go through the mountain or over it? And I said, I don't really know. All right, we don't have any title yet. These are the tools that were used. A term I learned from the surveying office in Boonesboro, their model surveying office was circumferentor. They wouldn't have said compass, but it's going to be used to determine bearing. It's going to, you're going to have a transit to determine arc. You're going to have chains, the Gunther chains, for example. That's going to be used for measurement. It will either be mounted on, well, the chain, not the chains, but the circumferentor and the transit, on a tripod or on that Jacob staff. Okay? You're going to have 2 people, one on each side, chain carriers, chainmen, that are going to use a chain that is 4 poles long, 16.5 feet per pole. How long is the chain? And carry the 2? 16.5 times 4. 66. A 2-pole chain is going to be 33 feet. That's how they're going to measure Kentucky. That's how your McAfee's are going to be measuring Kentucky. Chains are still used for measurement in Kentucky. That woke you up. But not by our modern surveyors. They have other ways. They were measuring up at Farmers Bank the other day, West Bank. Friday night, Western Hills plays Franklin County. How do you measure it down? What do you use? Chains. Chains. Now try to imagine packing those chains over the hills and the hollers. That's what they did. They would have a marker who would blaze the trees or plant a stake. Some of those blazings are still in place, the surveyors have told me. If the surveyor did not walk off enough land, he was held financially accountable. Surveyors have told me for that reason, they usually walked off a little bit more than they were supposed to walk. And I said, do you know what that has done down through time when it comes to litigation and trying to survey a piece of property if you've walked off more and you've taken it back to patent? So we've got chain carriers. I had a woman come in from Casey County, and she said, have you ever heard of so-and-so? And I said, I believe he was a surveyor down there, wasn't he? She said, yes, he was my daddy. I packed chains for him. I chained him. So they weren't necessarily family members. They weren't neighbors. To me, they were just hanging out at the surveyor's office that day, and he had some money he needed to pay to get that done, you know. So they were willing to go out and help him with the survey. Final step is the grant. This is when the governor conveys title to the person who is the last one on the list. He may not have been the one that got the warrant. He may not have been the one for whom the survey was made, but due to assignments, this is the last one on the list who's ready to take title. These are called patent deeds. Now, if you talk to the people in Virginia, they're going to tell you the grant is the patent. But you're going to shortchange your own research if you stick with that. I challenge Kentucky researchers to look at all of the steps, to know who qualified for the warrant, what type of warrant was it, when was the entry filed and where, who were the people conducting the survey. You know, those chain carriers may not have had any interest in the land, but their feet were on the ground that day, and that's First Families of Kentucky. They were here. Any conveyance after the grant is issued is filed with the county clerk. There is no central deed registration in Kentucky. And if anybody has any connections to Google, please let us know, because right now on Google, if you ask, where can I get a copy of my deed, go see the land office in the Secretary of State. We get these calls all of the time, you know, because people are looking for their deeds. I also encourage you, please, to support records preservation projects conducted by Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives or your county clerks. Because, friends, once those deeds are gone, you're not going to get another copy of it. It's important to support preservation. This is the land office copy of a grant that was signed by Thomas Jefferson, not as president, but as governor of Virginia. No presidents, no kings authorized grants in Kentucky. Remember that little proclamation line? Okay. It's going to be a governor of Virginia or a governor of Kentucky. Grants are still issued today under Chapter 56 of the Kentucky Revised Statutes. I think I've been a party to about 18 land patents since I started working for the state. Warrant plus entry plus survey plus grant equals the patenting process. Anything after that is on the local level. All right, now, it's 1779. The Declaration of Independence was signed July 4th, 1776. 3 years later now, after the Revolutionary War, Virginia needs to come up with a way to appropriate land. So we have two land laws, May 1779. Why? As various and vague claims to unpatented land under the former, that's the king, and the present government, Virginia, may produce tedious and infinite litigation and disputes, and in the meantime, purchasers would be discouraged from taking up lands upon terms lately prescribed by law, whereby the fund to be raised in aid of the what? Taxes. They're going to, for discharging the public debt, would be in great measure frustrated. They passed these laws, which you can see online. Please know, I am not telling you how this worked. I encourage you to access the laws yourself. We have them online. Then you'll be able to see how this process worked down through time. Early Kentucky land claims. Here you go in your McAfee's, Emily. Okay. Future proclamation claims were limited to Virginia veterans or warrants issued by Virginia governors. We're talking about the western waters of Virginia. We're talking about Kentucky. The law excluded land claims for service in companies or militia detachments. That's why you won't find Daniel Boone getting a military warrant on our database. The militia companies were exempt from the bounty land warrant process. Your boots had to be on the ground fighting in the Virginia Continental Army or the Virginia State Line. Militia companies didn't count, even though they did some of the hardest fighting. You're not going to see it. All right? Secondly, be it enacted and declared that all persons so settled upon any unpatented lands, surveyed as before mentioned, except only such lands as before the settlement of the same were notoriously reserved by the respective companies for their own use, Transylvania, Loyalist, Ohio, going on, their titles must be confirmed by the members of such companies. They're going to have to go through the patenting process with a limit of only 300 acres. That isn't going to fly. You just saw how many, thousands of acres were up for grabs here. They're going to have to go through the same process as every other settler. The only surveying company that would receive compensation for their work in the Kentucky County area would be Richard Henderson, the Transylvania Company. He would be given a special grant of 2,000 acres in western Kentucky. He could divide that up in lots, pay the men who surveyed for him, or sell it off in lots. Now let's see if we can figure out where Henderson's grant may have been located. Would we want to say Henderson County? Yes, We're talking out western. He's going to be the one that is going to be rewarded for his work here in negotiating treaties. The rest of them, you're going to have to go through the process, including Daniel Boone, just like everybody else. And Daniel did. Okay? Now, we want to talk about Frankfort. A calendar of the warrants for land in Kentucky granted for service in the French and Indian War, abstracted by Philip Fall Taylor. I'm sure this book is in this library. If you look down, you'll see Zachary Taylor was a sergeant in the French and Indian War, and he was paid 200 acres. It was surveyed June the 17th, 1774 by Hancock Taylor. The county was Fincastle, on a branch of the Kentucky River, which empties at the Great Crossing, being the waters of the Ohio. Check that survey date. June 17th, 1774. It's still under the King's control. Still under the King's control, and it's west of the Proclamation line. Is this going to die on the vine? What's going to happen? We're going to go see the Land Office website hosted by Michael Adams, and we're going to open that box up there, that triangle that says Land Office. It will direct us to a page with all sorts of, as my coworker says, Neapolitan sherbet colors. This may change. We're going to be looking at some of those arrows, the topics, but the one at the top is the one we're going to see first. Search Virginia and Old Kentucky patents. We're going to sort the names in alpha order, since we don't know the patent number unless we've looked in the blue book published by the Kentucky Historical Society, which is linked, thank you, Stuart, to our website. We're going to scroll down, and we're going to find a patent was in fact issued to Zachary Taylor. Let's open this up. Oh, by the way, you can download this in TIFF format. It will not cost you anything, because my fellow Kentuckians, you've already paid for this. Ken Harper started this preservation project at the Historical Society back in the 70s. And I'm talking 1970s, not 1770s. Okay. All right. Now, some of the documents are missing, but let's take a look. We have got Fincastle County, and we've got the date of the survey. Pardon me, my television friends. I've got to move. This is the way I roll, okay? Thank you. I knew you'd understand. All right. Now, this is going to be the shape of this patent. It's going to be surveyed by William Preston, surveyor of Fincastle County, and surveyed by Hancock Taylor, the assistant. Hancock is going to survey it for William Preston. We have the date of survey, and even notice they gave a magnetic variation at that time. These were very accurate. And it talks about serving as a sergeant in the 2nd Virginia Regiment. In your handout, I've also told you that Preston was a captain of Company of Rangers from Augusta County during the French and Indian War. He was county lieutenant. The area included the present state of Kentucky. And then we talk about the grave of Hancock Taylor. So we have Preston and we have Hancock Taylor doing the survey under the auspices of Preston. No title was granted yet. Again, the date is 1774. Now, we're going to find that Thomas Jefferson, as governor of Virginia, is going to convey title to Zachary Taylor on June the 22nd, 1780. It's after the Revolutionary War. It's up to Virginia to decide how we're going to grant this land. We are honoring French and Indian War warrants as stated by the Proclamation of 1763 and then confirmed by the land law passed by Virginia. They're not going to lose this tract. It's going to be granted by Governor Jefferson. There are some more provisions in the land law of 1779. Bona fide settlers upon the western waters prior or before January 1st, 1778 were entitled to 400 acres of land, including their settlement. Proof of planting a crop of corn or a residency of at least 1 year was required. Dr. Clark called these the corn and cabin claims. That's one, okay? How many acres could you get under a certificate of settlement and a preemption warrant? 400 plus 1,000. 1,000 acres, 1,400 acres. Settlers could purchase a preemption warrant adjacent to that certificate of settlement. It's a whole lot better than 300 acres, isn't it? Persons who settled upon the western waters after January 1st, 1778, were entitled to a 400-acre preemption warrant claim. This one is important too, the last one. Persons who had marked out claims and built any house or hut, and sometimes they were just thrown up pieces of straw, branches, nothing really major, prior to January 1st, 1778, were entitled to one 1,000-acre preemption warrant if the Land Commission approved their claim. Abraham Chaplin did a lot of surveying in western Mercer County, took a lot of men with him. They would draw lots for this 1,000 acres, this 1,000 acres, but they could only do one lot of 1,000 acres per man. Once that patent was issued, you could buy some, the other guy's lots. But I call these chop claims. Basically, they're just, chopping a tree, saying, okay, I'm going to take from here to here, you draw here. Or lottery claims. We also see them called that. All locations or entries made by officers and soldiers upon lands of actual soldiers were declared void because they're going to be going to western Kentucky, with the exception of the soldiers who had fought in the French and Indian War or Lord Dunmore's War. How are you going to decide who was in here? How are they going to know? How are they going to know back in Virginia who's what? How do you do that? Okay, the land law said we're going to set up districts. The counties of Monongalia, Yahogania, and Ohio, one district. Counties of Augusta, Botetourt, Greenbrier into another one. Washington and Montgomery, you saw those on the map earlier, another district. And the county of Kentucky will be another district. They're going to appoint commissioners to come to Kentucky and to listen to witnesses, verify. Emily was here prior to January 1st, 1778. I'm going to verify for you. You verify I was. Oh, yes, women could do this. Wow. Women could. Diana Denton. Yes, they were involved in this too. Okay? The land commissioners worked a circuit in Kentucky from October 14th, 1779 through January 26, 1780. Land law was written in May 1779. The circuit included St. Asaph or Logan's Fort, Harrodsburg, Falls of the Ohio, Louisville, Boonesboro, and Bryant Station near Lexington. You literally would travel to one of those land courts and stake your claims. Then the commissioners would decide whether you met the requirements. We're going to jump over to the early certificates of settlement and preemption warrants website, and we're going to look up a name, William Hayden. We're going to see if there's anything on here that tells us whether or not he got a land patent, and if so, why? Well, I got a hit down here. Preemption warrant, cropped image, location, Kentucky River, above Leestown, a link to a patent, okay? And this is going to tell me why William Hayden got it. Then we're going to piece these together in just a few minutes. That, my friends, is the result of some researchers going to the Library of Virginia and asking, do you have anything that we haven't seen about Kentucky yet? These two genealogists sat there while the librarians at Library of Virginia pulled out 2 boxes. And in it were the original commissioner certificates. I know. I've got a motorcycle gang right now ready to go get them. Maybe more than one. At any rate, Kentucky County, we do hereby certify that William Hayden is entitled to the preemption of 1,000 acres of land at the state price, the District of Kentucky, on account of marking and improving the same in the year 1776, lying on Kentucky River, about 2 miles above Leestown, to include his improvement, given under our hands at Bryant Station on Elkhorn Creek, January 3rd, 1780. Signed, William Fleming, Stephen Trigg, Edmund Line. Mr. Barber was another one of them. The clerk was John Williams. We used the Gazetteer to find that Leestown was settled in 1776 by Hancock Lee and Cyrus McCracken, 1 mile below Frankfort, east bank of Kentucky River. Yes. All right, he's got an authorization. This is a chop claim. There's no mention of a crop. That's why it's not 1,400 acres. It's a chop claim, 1,000 acres. I used the entries for Kentucky County, Virginia, to see where William Hayden enters a preemption warrant of 1,000 acres in Kentucky on the Kentucky River, adjoining the above Leesburg, including an improvement. Please notice the spelling. Any researchers that will go to the grave saying, if it's not spelled the way I want it spelled, it can't be mine. They're phonetically spelling a name. Hayden. William Hayden is spelled Hedden here. The entry has been filed. No title has been conveyed. There's another step to go. All right, and then down here, Ben Hayden entered 400 acres by virtue of a preemption warrant, joining William Hayden on the north, including, and look at this particular reference, Lee's Stamping Ground. This was done, look at the date, 1780. Sorry this didn't turn out as well as it should, but this is the warrant that Hayden received from the Land Commission or Land Court authorizing the surveying of 1,000 acres. It was good for him, his heirs, or assigns. The warrant was issued 1780. No title has conveyed. Here is the survey that depicts the tract being patented, either by Hayden or someone else. The survey chainmen were Benjamin Hayden and James Hayden. And William Hayden is, the marker, the pilot and the marker. And it was done by John Williams, the deputy surveyor. Is this Fayette County instead of Fincastle? And a portion of the grant was just cropped for this presentation. Hayden is going to take title to that 1,000 acres from the governor of Virginia. All right, now, we talked about French and Indian War soldiers. We've talked about settlers of all different kinds. What about those speculators? Guess what? There were speculators back then, too. They're wanting to make some money. They're wanting to send people out. Go out, survey this, then I'll give you a share of the profits if the patent clears. So the land law said you can buy a treasury warrant at the amount of 40 pounds for every 100 acres if it does not compete with someone's certificate of settlement or preemption warrant or military claim. You're going to see tens of thousands of acres surveyed under treasury warrants in Kentucky. Here's an example of one. I do apologize for the quality, and I apologize to the cameraman, okay? Patrick Henry is going to issue a land grant to a purchaser of this treasury warrant, and notice the assignments on the back. Might have done better if we turned the lights down a little bit, but bottom line, you've got your PowerPoint handouts to go by. This is how Campbell Street is going to be patented. Let's go through this. Thank you. Aaron Darnold. He purchased a treasury warrant authorizing 535.5 acres in surveys. He paid £900 for it. This is in 1783. Now, see those assignments on the back? He's getting rid of it. One of the more interesting ones that I found was he sold the warrant over to John Bradford, the editor of the Kentucky Gazette. And that's going to be Bradford's signature to someone that bought the warrant again. We see Humphrey Marshall being involved here. Humphrey Marshall, okay. Let's do a little bit of research here. I've got a survey that is done for Humphrey Marshall. Can anybody tell what date it is? Like down there at the very bottom? 1785. Humphrey Marshall. He's the deputy surveyor for Thomas Marshall, the surveyor of Fayette County. The prominent statesman that we have always heard of, Humphrey Marshall, when was he born? Uh-oh. 1812. So could this Humphrey Marshall, who had the survey made, be the same Humphrey Marshall who was the ambassador to China and is buried in Frankfort Cemetery? I don't think so. I don't think. Same family, I'm sure. But bottom line is, we have to dig into the documents to prove or correct what has been established as a tradition. We do that all the time up at the office. But we're putting the documents in your hands. You do the digging, okay? That's the challenge, right? We have here the land grant that was signed by Patrick Henry, governor of Virginia. And this one, I believe, is this the Marshall one? I think it is. Okay, I'm kind of, title has now conveyed to that tract, to the older Humphrey Marshall. I should tell you something here. How many people do we have from the military here? Okay, some served, I'm sure. Okay. Kentucky is a state land state. We are not part of the federal public domain. Up until the 1940s, the federal government had to go through the legislature to get permission to buy property here, unless we ceded it over like Mammoth Cave. The legislature approved federal acquisition within our borders. In the 1940s, we ceded the right to the federal government to negotiate with property owners because we didn't have time to call the legislature into session to approve every land sale. The military was in a hurry to establish a particular site, and it had to be done now. So that we ceded over that right. The site they were building is called Fort Campbell. That is called the Umbrella Statute. We're going to cede over our right. We're going to relinquish our right, but there are going to be certain things we're going to hold on to. Since I've started working with Secretary of State, I've seen Fort Knox have to come to the legislature to get permission to go teach the children under Kara. We ceded over legislative authorization. So, little point of fact there. Now, this is just having a great time with me. All right, now, this is a land patent that is issued or involves George Campbell. Where in the world might that be? Now, I didn't get the original documents on here to save time. That's the land office copy of the survey and the land office copy of the grant, which you can see on our website. This is a survey that was done for George Mason. It's also in a very prominent place. Right, it's on the Kentucky River, and we have the meets and bounds description. The land grant was issued by Virginia Governor Patrick Henry prior to 1792. Now, this is all well and good. You've seen these patents. We're talking about them and the different types of warrants. That's great. But what about the Revolutionary War? Where did they go? No entry or location of land shall be admitted within the county and limits of the Cherokee Indians. Tressa, we're going to reserve an area for the Cherokee, or on the northwest side of the Ohio River, or reserved for any particular nation or tribe of Indians, or on Henderson's grant, for the benefit of the troops serving in the present war, bounded by Green River. This is what it looks like. The military district for Virginia veterans only is that gray shaded area. Is Frankfort in there? No. So the only military warrants that could be used to acquire land here were going to be for French and Indian War service, like we've seen for Zachary Taylor. At the far left, the lower third of the Jackson Purchase was owned by the Chickasaw until 1818. Tressa, am I doing okay? I'm building your claims here. All right. In 1818, it's going to be ceded over to, we're going to get it from the federal government. It's going to come to Kentucky. But this area on the right, Cherokee land until 1805, this is the only area that I see where there are certain requirements. The land was going to be sold by warrant to people who had resided on that tract for at least 6 months. But no Native Americans could participate. Because when they got the money, they'd already resided on it for 6 months. They would have been paying to get it back. 1810 is when that legislation was passed. The sale of the warrants in the Tellico series that came about because of the Treaty at Jellicoe, Tennessee, would be used to finance the state militia. Why would we need a state militia? It's 1810. War of 1812 is coming up. War of 1812. We're going to use the sale of unappropriated land or newly acquired land to finance militia. The rest of the area above the military district will be authorized by other types of warrants. Franklin County. You know, we had a lot of Revolutionary War pensioners who resided here. They just couldn't use their military warrant here. One of them was Humphrey Marshall, a captain, lieutenant in the Virginia State Troops. He was still alive in 1832. He was collecting a pension. Now, what about those other veterans? Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina. They could not use bounty land warrants in Kentucky. There's another page of those warrants. I encourage you, if you have not done so, use revoirapps.org. It's a free website. You can see abstracts of those Revolutionary warrants pension applications. Here is Humphrey Marshall's application, and they will give you information about family. They may also give you signatures. Just in case you're on fold 3, which requires a membership fee, and you can't read some words, check this out. They keep adding names all of the time. revoirapps.org. And there's some more. There's H. Marshall's. I can use that signature to match up to a marriage bond, for example. And see, you know, and then it talks about when he passed, July 3rd. A lot of information about where they were, for whom they fought, and why they feel that they are entitled to a pension. Okay, talked about land patents. That's fine. How do we piece them together? Let's go quilting. I'm going to use Willard Rouse Gilson's wonderful map to identify the patents in that particular area of Frankfort. And if you'll see, we've got Zachary Taylor's 200-acre survey, Virginia patent. Get on that website, you can see the documents. You can see William Hayden's 1,000-acre claim, and he also had 425 acres. That's going to be across the river, isn't it? You're going to find Humphrey Marshall. You're going to see George Mason's. It's going to cover the grounds where the Capitol is located, the new Capitol. And there's George Campbell's patent that we've just seen a few minutes ago, where Campbell Street is located. Isn't that funny that they named it after Mr. Campbell? But he was the first landowner. What they would do is they'd get these patents and then start selling them off in bits and pieces. That's how they made their money. I'd like to encourage you as well to look at tax lists. They identify history, demographics, and family information. Tax time. From 1795 until the 1880s, tax lists are available on microfilm at the Kentucky History Center and the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives, also at Church of Latter-day Saints libraries. I selected the name John Brown for obvious reasons. That name is very familiar. How would you know which John Brown it is? This John Brown is on the tax list for 1813. And notice, this John Brown has property ownership all across the state. He's got it in, Henderson County, Ohio County, goes on. The entered by, surveyed for, patented 2 columns will tell you who patented the land originally. I'm going to go to the next page. Oh, wait, I wanted to point something out too. Pardon me, I'm driving a camera crazy, I know. All right, I've got Elizabeth Brown, a woman paying taxes. I've got Elizabeth Berry, it looks like, okay? And then I've got Nancy, and then I've got Robert. Formerly, it's owned, isn't it? Formerly belonging to Martin Hardman. Free Black. It's on the tax lists. Identifying by name and also who his former owner was. But with John Brown, okay, this is that first page. Up at the top, it tells you that John Brown owned pieces and parts of patents that had been issued to Zachary Taylor, Humphrey Marshall, and William Hayden. Tells how many blacks he owned, and the value of his town lots, 5,000 pounds or dollars, and he owned 4-wheeled carriages. See how you can study who owns what, the stores, the billiard tables. It's all on the tax lists. 1813. Here are the headers in 1830. First-rate, second-rate, third-rate land. How do you do that if you're out in the rural areas? First-rate land means you pay higher taxes. It's more tillable. Bluegrass. Second, gently rolling. Third rate. This is how my Aunt Mary Kennan Drury would describe the land in Duncan, Kentucky, Mercer County. It's about that high. She said, Candy, we didn't lean over to set tobacco, we just poked it in. If you know what I'm talking about, those hills down there. Right. Wholesale stores, tavern license. You can get the demographics of your county just by studying tax lists. They're annual. 1875, you had to report the number of watches and clocks that you owned. Tax lists are available at the History Center, as we said. From 1795 to the mid-1830s, you will find information about the land patentees originally, if known. We won't go through all of those particular headers. I would like to point out a link to the National Bureau of Land Management. What about the War of 1812? I did a search for Adair, and I found that he was paid for his services as a brigadier general in the Kentucky militia during the War of 1812. We sent a lot of soldiers to fight in the War of 1812, but they could not use their federally issued bounty land warrants inside Kentucky boundaries. They had to be issued in public domain states such as Illinois, Missouri, west. You see why that reason they're moving? They either sold those warrants or they moved themselves. That land grant was issued by Franklin Pierce. We have 9 different patent series. Not all of them are online. Virginia and Kentucky's, Western Tennessee River Military, non-military, Jackson Purchase Locator, KLWs we're working on now, and County Court Orders Database. If I do a search on County Court Orders, and I'm going to do Franklin County, I'll see that patents were issued after 1835 in Franklin County. I want to see the county formation table. I'm going to look at Franklin County. Lots of interesting information in there about the old wagon road. And also there was an amendment so that somebody could have his house between Frankfort and Anderson County. The legislature changed it. South of Green River, Tellico is online as a test site. Tennessee land is not. We don't have the other entry books online at this time. I encourage you to study deeds. No central registration of deeds in Kentucky. Establish a chain of title. Commissioner's deeds. Somebody doesn't pay their taxes. They're going to be in the deed books in the county clerk's office. Processioner's deeds. Daddy had 1,000 acres. He died. 4 heirs. Processioners are appointed to divide that 1,000 acres into 4 different tracts and tell which heir will get which tract. Those are usually with the county records as well. Wills bequeath property, and land patents do too. Federal government does not issue land patents in Kentucky. Warrants do not specify a particular location. Neither do warrants. Surveys do not convey title. The only military warrants honored in Kentucky were for service in the French and Indian War and Revolutionary War. We are the repository for over 100,000 patent files. We are in a vault now, and this is good. Remember your county formation. No central registration of deeds. Be creative when spelling. Patents were issued to women. African Americans could patent land prior to the Civil War. Our holdings are limited to patents only. I also encourage you to study court cases. If someone filed a complaint against the distribution by the processioners, you might find a court case. It'll give you a lot of information there. I want to thank you all kindly for your help in preserving Kentucky history. I'm going to tell one quick story, and that's going to be the end of it, because here comes Fayette County. My brother was the Central Kentucky's fisheries biologist for Fish and Wildlife. He was Kerry Prather. He called me on a July 4th one day, and yeah, you knew him. He said, "You want to go for a boat ride?" And I said, "Of course." And he said, "Where do you want to put in?" I said, "I want to go where Benson Creek goes into the Kentucky River." "Why?" I said, "That's historic. That's an important place, because if you look, the river is up here. It was pointed out to me by another researcher not too long ago. I mean, there's a nice camp place right there at the flats of Benson there." Well, he brought the boat out, and I got in and I started crying. And he said, "What is the matter with you?" I said, "You do not understand. I have worked with these things for 45 and a half years. I am on holy ground." He goes, "These fish are really struggling. I need to call somebody." My sister-in-law was in the boat, and she said, "I think you both are crazy." So, it's not crazy preserving history. It's fun. It really is. Thank you for being here today. Check out our website.
While we're setting up real quick for the Q&A session, I wanted to thank everybody for their presentations. Please give them another round of applause. Our speakers today were curated from the best of the best in Kentucky, by the way. When I was putting this together, I contacted 4 people. Bill Hainberg, who was the former state geologist, and Drew Andrews is now the acting director as of July 3rd. Tressa Brown, Candy Atkinson, you're retiring at the end of this month, is that correct?
Next Friday's my last day.
Next Friday. So we are extra fortunate to have these people with us today. The second person I contacted about this was Craig Potts, the State Historic Preservation Officer for the Kentucky Heritage Council. Also, Stuart Sanders, the Director of Collections and Research at the Kentucky Historical Society, and Gwen Henderson, the Director of Education with the Kentucky Archaeological Survey. So you got the best of their recommendations, and I want you to know that. I'm glad you did the segue into Colonel William Preston. One of the reasons John Brown, by the way, had all that land all across Kentucky is Colonel William Preston, the official surveyor of Fincastle County, Virginia, was the uncle of Senator John Brown. He was the he was the brother of Margaret Preston, and Leslie Miller helped me figure that out, who is the chair of the National Committee for the Activities Committee for the National DAR, and she's with us today. Thank you. So I just wanted to say thank you all again, and we're looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, John. If we could have our presenters come and take a seat at the front here, I would invite Dr. Andrews and Emily and Tressa and Candy to come right up here while I introduce our moderator for our Q&A panel, Dr. Richard Taylor. Dr. Taylor is the author of numerous collections of poetry, 2 historical novels, and several books relating to Kentucky history, including Elkhorn, Evolution of a Kentucky Landmark. He's also Kentucky's Poet Laureate from 1999 to 2000, and has received 2 creative writing fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as an Al Smith Award from the Kentucky Arts Council. His publication awards include, among others, the Thomas D. Clark Medallion, which he received for his book Elkhorn. He taught at Kentucky State University until retiring in 2008, and recently retired from Transylvania University after 14 years as Keenan visiting writer. Dr. Taylor is co-owner of Poor Richard's Books, of course, right here over here on Broadway. And in March, he was inducted into the Kentucky Writers Hall of Fame. Dr. Taylor also happens to be a descendant of Hancock Taylor's uncle, Colonel George Taylor. So I welcome Dr. Richard Taylor to the podium to moderate our discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
States representative. So let's say that how many, this has been divided, but do you think there's like some land out there somewhere that if you searched it, you would find that maybe your descendant had it and you could bring it forward? Is that a hard process?
2 questions here. First of all, back in 1992, Secretary Erler said we would provide free copies to anyone who still has a patent, who still occupies that patent. He thought maybe there would be 2 or 3 that would call that out, several hundred. We still have people living on patent farms that their ancestors had acquired, and they have the papers. If you'll notice in the grant, it will say to their heirs or their sons. So if it says heirs, it's automatically going to descend to a family member. But we do encourage them to make sure they check in with the PVA. They may not have recorded a deed on the property with the county clerk because they have a land patent. I've been told in eastern Kentucky that they have those original land grants folded up in their Bibles. And that's what they use to say, this is mine. Just make sure you go to the PVA, because if you don't, you could still lose that. Right. So, but as far as new patents, As I said, I've been involved in the issuance of about 18 patents. I had a surveyor from Western Kentucky, whose word I would take to the bank, said, I found a strip that hasn't been patented yet. And I said, explain it to me. And he said, well, it's an old bear wallow. He said, nobody wanted it. He said, I read the title and did a survey for my customer, my client. It didn't go as far as he thought it did. The one on the other side, he said, mine doesn't go there either, and I don't want it. So we issued a land patent. But what is interesting is the fiscal court under Chapter 56 is the one that issues the warrant or certificate. A survey is made supposedly by the county surveyor. If there's not one, one is appointed. In the presence of two disinterested chairmen. The paperwork is sent to the Secretary of State's office. We ask the Attorney General to review it. Invariably, the Attorney General will say, what in the world is this? We'll say, this is one of 100,000. Okay? They'll say it meets statutory requirements. Then we type up the grant and send it to the governor's office for signature. The Secretary of State will take the original warrant or certificate and write satisfied across the face of it. Means it can't be used again. Or, in some cases, satisfied in part. So, yes, we still issue land patents. Yes, there are still patents in the possession of family members today. And no, I don't know where there's any property ready to be patented. I've been a wealthy woman of all time.
Next question. Please.
I was confused about the change from spear points to arrowheads. When did that occur, and was that something that occurred, I guess depending on the time, was that something that occurred simultaneously in different places around the world?
Yes, yes, it's different places around the world did it at different times. Here, it was about 900 years ago now. And it could have been plus or minus 100 years, depending on which end of the state you were on. But the spear points got progressively smaller and smaller as the critters they were hunting got smaller and smaller, essentially. Now, there are some quite large blades that have been found, and they were essentially ceremonial because they were made out of material that wouldn't really hold up for hunting, like obsidian that was traded in here. And some of those blades are 12 or 15 inches long. You wouldn't go hunting with something like that. But the arrowheads are all different sizes, because if you were going to hunt a bear or an elk, you would need a different size point than if you were going to hunt birds or rabbits or something like that. The spear points also had a variety of different shapes. They could be anything. There's probably 100 different names for the style of point. And people that know lithics, know their stone tools, can look at one and say, oh, that's a turkey tail and it's made from Mercer chert, because you can identify it by the design of it, by the style of it, but also by the stone that it's made from, so that you know at least where the stone came from in Kentucky or outside of Kentucky traded in. And you also have an idea that these styles are localized. And if you're a lithics person, you can say, oh, well, that's a such and so from, such and so, Mercer County, probably in this time period. I am not that person. I'm just not. So generally speaking, yes, over time, they shifted from points, from spear points to arrowheads. They still use spears for a long time, but arrows became, you can stay further away from something and you're fairly accurate, and the power with a bow is fairly sizable, so you can be safer and still effective at a distance with a bow and arrow.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Kind of a hybrid question. Is there a sense of when property and river navigation became an issue where you own property to the center line of the river or the creek? And second part is, when would the Kentucky River have become navigable, without the dams? Is it, you talked about how the Ice Age reversed the Ohio River. Did the Kentucky River always flow in its current state, and how?
Yeah, before engineering, the Kentucky River was a pool and riffle stream. And so where every major creek comes into, and it's still the case, you just don't see it, it's underwater. Where every major creek comes into the river, there's a big gravel bar. And so at low water, when the water's down, those were places you could ford, at least get farther across the river. And then there were pools in between, and then people would, prior to navigation, people would set up a ferry in the pool next to the riffle where the ford was. And so, in terms of it being permanently navigable, it was in the 1830s when the Corps of Engineers started putting in the dams. That's what ensured the permanent navigation. It then meant you could have steamboat traffic. You could make plans for, regular steamboat routes, regular steamboat. You weren't relying on the weather. And so until the 1830s, it was the natural flood cycle, and that was it. And it really wasn't very predictable. So that kind of answers your question. Yeah.
So, with a property issue, were the warrants you dealt with based sometimes on the variance of the streams there?
Right. Thank you for that question. This is another aspect of Kentucky history we tend to overlook, is the mapping of the state boundaries. Since I've been at the Secretary's office, the Supreme Court, or the big one, U.S. Supreme Court ordered the mapping of the boundaries with Kentucky, Illinois, Kentucky, Indiana, and Kentucky, Ohio. And they wanted to set up the GIS coordinates for those. Yes, all right. So we've got this plethora, an abundance of maps, and the Master Commissioner's report. Why, might you ask, was that important? Okay, Kentucky, Illinois. Illinois wanted to put a casino boat in the river, Ohio River. Certain people objected to that on our side, so we had to have it mapped. The Attorney General's office got so detailed, they wanted to know who took care of the fish, who take care of it on that. That's how they do that. Also along Henderson, when the water levels are low, I've had several people file land patents on the accretion because they didn't want someone to dredge there. The fiscal court supposedly has the right to dredge when the river is low, and those landowners didn't want that. So we've got about 6 or 7 land patents issued to people along the river, and that land was surveyed when the water was low. But I think the most interesting one was Kentucky, Indiana. We have that. We got a call one day and said, can you tell me where the boundary with Kentucky and Indiana is? I said, well, you have to be a little bit more specific. And they told me the point where the Madison Regatta is going to be. And I said, okay, the Madison Regatta. Okay, I can get that map for you and get a copy. And I said, do we have a boundary problem there? He said, no, we've got a guy that's late on his child support, and we're going to send a boat out to get him when he hits that point. And I thought, in what? How are you going to get him when he crosses over into Kentucky? And I don't know what happened to him, but the other boundaries have not been mapped. Did you know that Kentucky is supposed to go down to the 3630? That Jackson Purchase Base is supposed to be the boundary of Kentucky across, all the way across. But the surveyor G'd when he should have hawed, and we lost a chunk of property. But we did agree to honor the land, they agreed to honor the land patents we had issued south of the Walker's line. But on that map in your PowerPoint, you're going to see Kentucky stretched 3630. That's where it went.
And I know a lot of people are familiar with the idea that sometimes your land boundary goes to an oak tree, and maybe the oak tree is not there anymore. Well, a lot of these boundaries for the state were defined as the center line of the river. The river moves. And at one point, there was a economic downturn, and Indiana couldn't pay their share of taking care of the Ohio River. The pulling all trees and things out to keep it open for navigation was very important. And Indiana couldn't pay their half of the bill for clearing that set of snags, and they agreed to let Kentucky have to the low water side on the Indiana shore as the boundary. And it moves.
Right.
And so we have land that's grown in Kentucky and land that's been eroded from Indiana. It's been a very complex and dynamic boundary. And so where was the low water in 1838 versus where is it now? And so there's been a lot of dispute trying to sort a lot of that out. Yeah.
I've got a couple, go ahead.
Okay. Drew, you were telling me when we were talking over here that there are podcasts on YouTube about Kentucky geology. Can you give us some website? Where would we go? Because
If you go to the Kentucky Geological Survey website,
okay.
kgs.uky.edu, you'll see right there on the front page links to what we call the Big Blue Rock Pod. And it's a podcast about Kentucky geology. They put out about once a month or so.
Was what now? What was the name after I type in?
It's the Big Blue Rock Pod.
Big Blue Rock. Okay.
And so you can access it through our website, but it's also on a lot of the podcast.
Okay,
You know,
okay, that'll start me. Good,
sites.
thank you.
Yeah.
I was going to ask Emily Preston, in the journal, are there references to the naming of Elkhorn Creek? I think that party named the creek.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They did, didn't they?
So,
Are you saying did the McAfees name it?
Did the McAfees or Taylor one name it?
And perhaps Taylor. I don't think they did because they veered over in the Mercer County direction. They had named Eagle. Drennan's, I'm not, even though they're calling it that in the journal was gotten together at a later date, and so there were names used in there so that the readers would know, but that had been given later than that 1773 through 74 expedition.
And Tressa Brown, I have a question for you. Is there any evidence on the main stem of Elkhorn of Indian encampments or Native American encampments?
I don't know specifically.
Okay.
I would be surprised if there was not.
Okay.
I mean, there's not a county in the state that doesn't have sites, and many, many sites along waterways.
Yeah, I know that we're on the other stems that they're documented, and Bennett Young cites one near Lexington, I think.
I can look.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just curious. Any other questions? Yes, a lot of them.
Question for Emily, are those journals available?
They are. They're out on the internet. The really good comprehensive one is on a site hosted by a woman named Jenny Tenlen, Tenlen. And so if you see, I think her site is Drizzle Hosting. And so it's the whole McAfee genealogy, but as part of that, it is the Robert B. McAfee journals downloaded. So it's wonderful.
Go ahead.
I have a question about Hancock Taylor, and I understand you're a relative.
Mm-hmm.
Where he was killed by Native Americans, their survey party was attacked. That land's supposed to be owned by Eastern Kentucky University.
Right.
And they asked me about finding his grave with like GPR or something. But I looked in the historical documents, and I think he's buried in Louisville. But this state marker, and it's in Richmond now, and it's in this packet. It says he's buried there still.
Yes, I've been to his grave.
That's what I thought.
And the Hancock Taylor who's buried in Louisville is very likely the son of Zachary Taylor, the president.
Oh, there's two.
And he named his son in honor of his deceased uncle.
So Hancock Taylor could be buried in Madison County now?
May I clarify something?
Go ahead.
I'm fairly certain Hancock was actually injured in the Louisville area, but they were trying to get him to the settlements to be treated, and so he died in Madison County.
Okay, that's right.
That's what
As they say, historians differ, but
That's right.
all the accounts I've read say that he was actually ambushed on the Kentucky River. I've seen a couple of sources that say somewhere near Frankfort. He lived for 4 days. 2 days he was able to walk. The third day he was carried and died on what is called the Taylor's Fork of Silver Creek in Madison County.
That I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, but I don't think he had been to Louisville. He had surveyed Louisville with bullet. I mean, part of that bullet. Bullet is, of course, the bullets of Louisville. Oxmoor is bullet. I wanted to mention one other journal that comes a little later that is invaluable. It's been reprinted recently. It's called the Journal of Nicholas Criswell, and it recounts a visit up the Kentucky River to the site of Frankfort in 1775. Criswell is Creswell, and it is, unlike so many of the early journals, this one goes into a lot of detail. It's several hundred pages long, and it's really excellent if you're interested in this subject. Nancy?
Well, first of all, I want to thank John and everybody for this has been such a wonderful workshop. What I was wondering is, because Kentucky is so blessed with so many waterways, and the early surveying, as I understand, a lot of time used the waterways as boundaries. The first 3 counties of Kentucky, and then we had 6 more counties divided into those, out of those, so we had 9 counties in Kentucky before it became a state in 1792. So I've always understood in my research at LRC that a lot of the original 9 counties relied heavily on water boundaries for their surveying. And to me it makes logical sense, because it's very hard to put any kind of chains all the way from, when you're doing like the first 3 counties of Kentucky County. So I was wondering if you all could help me on, is that a true kind of generic thing that happens?
In the surveys, they were supposed to keep them rectangular. Take a look at those patents for Frankfort. They didn't. But they were required to cite the closest water course. And that's why when they were in Lexington, they called it Ohio River, because it was there. But I'm going to underscore what you're saying. We overlook the water courses and that way of coming into Kentucky by flat road or dugout canoe. You go to Fort Pitt, catch the Ohio, Three River Stadium, fellas, okay, and catch the Ohio, and then turn left at Carrollton or get off at Mays Lick. There were so many ways in. I guess on those tax lists, they wanted you to know, identify what's your closest water course on your patent. Now, if you go to western Kentucky and fly over that, you'll see the ranges and townships and sections just about. You'll see the corners. When you fly over a federal public domain state, you'll see those. But here, I've always been told, like my brother, we have more water courses inside the 48 than any other state in the Union. And of course, water is, and I wanted to add too, I live off 460, Georgetown Road. That area was patented by French and Indian War soldiers. The Lewises patented those, the Forks of Elkhorn, and that we're calling it the Elkhorn in the 1700s. So that name had already been established. But French and Indian War soldiers, they saw what was available here. We're awfully close to banking ground, for example. Yeah.
Yes, John?
Tressa, I know that Native American sites and a lot of history is kind of kept secret by the Heritage Council. What are public resources, good public resources that people could learn about Frankfort and Franklin County or the area native history?
That's not kept at the Heritage Council, that's the
And archaeological
State Office
survey.
of Archaeology,
Yes,
yeah. The state plan, the archaeological plan, there's 2 big volumes of that give you kind of an academic overview of the sites across. And that might give you a place to start. You can ask folks at Office of State Archaeology, they can tell you generically where things are. They are not going to tell you specifically where things are. Looting across the state is a huge problem. It is one of those things that seems to be linked with other types of nefarious behavior, running guns and drugs and human trafficking and looting. Our archaeological and historic sites all somehow go together, and that's why that information is restricted. Most of those sites are on private land, so again, you know, there's some restrictions there. But in general, you can get an idea from talking with good archaeologists around that will say, well, there are sites here, there are public, there are some public sites, obviously Wickliffe, Adena Mound outside of Lexington, that's on a public land, that's on UK land. There are sites on state park property. Again, most of these are not identified simply because we're trying to avoid looting. You know, the whole Indian Head Rock out of the middle of the river, that was probably a landmark for going up and down the river, and it's obviously no longer there. But I would say if you're interested in Franklin County, check out those 2 reports, the big volume of reports, and then the simplest thing to do is talk to Gwen or Dave. Yeah.
Thank you.
I just have a simple question for you. You use the term American Indian, but we're saying Native American, and I want to make sure I get it right. So why do you use American Indian, and can I do that?
You can. The federal government uses the term American Indian. All the people that I deal with, locally and personally, Native American or by tribe. So it depends on kind of your political bent. It depends on your personal perspective. Most people now will say, I'm part of the Native community, whether or not they're a tribal member, or they'll say they're indigenous. So, or they'll identify the particular tribe. So it really, if you're respectful, it doesn't matter which term you use.
All right, I think we've, yes?
I have a 2-part question. I saw mention of Bryant's Fort on Elkhorn Creek, wondered where that was at. And why did they make the locks narrower from Frankfort to Carrollton than they were from Frankfort up the river? Does anybody know that question? The answer.
On the construction of the locks, I don't know. They were standardizing for barges as they went. So it took 80 years to finish the sequence all the way up to Beattyville. And so they were more and more and more standardized as they went. And so if they were getting smaller, then the barges were becoming smaller. So that would be the only reason. Coming in from the Ohio, they were steamboats. And so as they went farther up, like I say, they were following a more prescribed construction pattern. I don't know the answer to, so somebody else brought that up. So, sorry.
Does anybody know where Bryant's Fort was? I saw mention of that on one of the slides at Elkhorn. Was that at the mouth of Elkhorn? I think it was Bryant's Fort.
Are you saying Brian's?
Bryant's Fort?
Bryant's.
Fort. at Elkhorn.
Are you saying Bryant?
Bryant's, B-R-Y-A-N-T-S.
Oh, Bryant.
That's probably Brian's station.
Okay.
But we were dealing with Franklin County on the patents. And let's remember, sometimes these water courses have name changes. You know, it could have been a different name now than it was back then. That's one of the joys of plotting these patents out, to see if there's a smaller water course identified that may be dry now or renamed now. That's not unusual. But the patents were selected were Franklin County, so it would have been somewhere around here.
Richard Taylor and Richard Greer, remember the Five Lives of Kentucky River is a published book that has a lot of history about the locks and dams and talks about the early construction. And so this is a publication you can get your hands on. I think they have it here in the library. And I've helped work for the Commonwealth on the divestiture from the feds to the state of the locks and dams. So I know enough to get dangerous. But my understanding of the original 1 through 4 were originally constructed by the Commonwealth. And then in around 1940 or so, 1 through 4, one's in Carrollton, 4's in Frankfort. The federal government then bought from the Commonwealth the locks and extended on up to Beattyville. And about the time they got finished, and this is documented in here, in 1880 or so, the railroad transportation became the primary economical source of transportation. So your locks and dams were already antiquated almost about at the same time. And the Corps kept jurisdiction on from 1 through 4 because we had a sand and gravel operation, the Goda Geese, right across from,
Sand pit.
Yes, and until they went out of operation, the Corps of Engineers continued to have jurisdiction for navigable waters.
I can't remember which locks did they build first, from Carrollton to Frankfort, or they started at the mouth?
Started at one. They started at the mouth and worked progressively upstream.
And each pool is a different, each dam is a different construction too. It's very fascinating, the different kind of aprons and things that they use. Yes.
Each one's unique, but the locks were, like I said, more standardized as they went upstream.
And the Corps has a publication that they've made on the history of the Kentucky River as well that includes all of that information.
Dr. Parrish, Chuck Parrish.
Right, Chuck Parrish.
Right.
What a nice man.
He was amazing.
They have different pool lengths between the locks depending on the drop of the river.
It was about the rise, It was about the rise, and the pool length became incidental to getting the rise that they needed, the pool depth that they needed to maintain navigation.
Yeah, they're shorter pool lengths up towards the mountains because they got more of a fall or whatever.
Yep.
I understand pool 1 is one of the longest and pool 2 is one of the shortest as far as geographic distance.
It may be,
I
but
believe that's
there's
the
some,
case.
but there's also some foundation issues from Frankfort downstream. From Frankfort upstream, they're able to get to bedrock as they build. From Frankfort downstream, dams 3 and 4 are built on some rock ledges that they're able to get to. 1 and 2 were, I think, just more opportunistic. It's like where they felt like they weren't going to get washed out because the foundation wasn't as secure, and they had to be a lot more figure out where they were going to put it. They have up to 80 feet of clay underneath Lock 1, so they had to be, they couldn't just pick it on top on the basis of rise.
Yeah.
Let's, since the hour is getting late, if there are no more pressing questions, let's
As
go
a
ahead.
panelist, I have one question, maybe for Tressa or whomever, and we had briefly talked about it, and that is, if we know there is a public works item that's about to be done, land perhaps paved over, etc., is there an automatic review for Native American presence on that land?
If the project has federal money, yes. If it has state money, the state does what it wants. If it's on private land, if it's a burial, you need to get county coroner there. Otherwise, if it's using federal money, we have oversight.
Let's thank our presenters again. And John Carlton and others have done a great deal of work, and it's so nice to see the dividends that it's paid. Let's give the library and John and all who've been involved